What happens when ancient mountains hold secrets older than memory? Tonight, I'm sharing 11 true encounters from the Appalachian wilderness, stories of phantom loggers working in absolute darkness, forests that breathe like living creatures, and congregations still holding service in churches that drowned decades ago. These aren't legends. These are documented experiences from people who ventured too deep into the hollows. Before we begin, drop your location and local time in the comments below. And if you're ready to descend into genuine Appalachian terror, subscribe to Bleak Fears and hit that notification bell. My name is Clayton, and I've spent the better part of 15 years exploring caves across Kentucky. I'm talking about the kind of caves that don't show up in tourist brochures, the ones that require you to squeeze through passages so tight you have to exhale to fit, where the darkness is so complete it feels like a physical presence pressing against your eyes. I've always found peace in those silent depths, away from the noise of the world above. But after what happened in the fall of 2019 near the Carter Caves area, I haven't been underground since. Some silences, I've learned, aren't empty at all. I was contracted by a geological survey team to document some unmapped cave systems in eastern Kentucky. The work was routine, at least by my standards. I'd go in with my equipment, take measurements, photograph formations, chart passages, and report back on anything noteworthy. The cave system I was assigned that October was on private land, owned by an elderly man who'd given the university permission to explore it. He'd mentioned that his grandfather had told stories about the caves, said there were passages that went on for miles, but no one had ever properly mapped them. That's what drew me in, honestly. The idea that in 2019 there were still completely unexplored places right here in Kentucky, hidden beneath farmland and forest. The entrance was unremarkable, just a gap between limestone rocks partially hidden by mountain laurel. I had to clear away years of accumulated leaves and debris just to get my gear through. Once inside, though, the cave opened up beautifully. The main passage was tall enough to stand in, with flowstone formations catching my headlamp like frozen waterfalls. I spent the first few hours doing standard documentation, taking photos and measurements, marking my route with reflective tags so I could find my way back. The cave had that particular smell they all have, that mineral dampness mixed with something ancient and untouched. About 4 hours in, I found what looked like a natural chimney leading down. It was steep but manageable with my climbing gear, dropping maybe 60 feet into a lower passage system. My altimeter showed I was getting deep, probably close to 300 feet below the surface by that point. The passage down there was different. Older somehow. The rock had been shaped by water that had stopped flowing centuries ago, leaving behind formations that looked almost deliberately carved. That's when I started noticing something strange. The silence felt different. I know how that sounds. Silence is silence, right? But anyone who's spent real time underground knows there are different qualities to it. There's the silence of small caves, where you can still feel the world above. And there's the profound silence of deep places where the earth swallows every sound. This was something else entirely. It felt expectant, like the moment before someone speaks. I stood still for a full minute, just listening, trying to identify what was bothering me. That's when I heard it. Singing. At first I thought it was my imagination, or maybe some acoustic trick of the cave. But as I moved forward, it became clearer. Multiple voices harmonizing perfectly, echoing from somewhere deeper in the cave system. They were singing Amazing Grace, and the sound was beautiful in a way that made my chest ache. I've heard echoes do strange things underground, carry sound in unexpected ways, but this was different. The harmonies were too perfect, too clear. And I was supposed to be completely alone, miles from any other human being, hundreds of feet underground. Every rational part of my brain was screaming at me to turn around. You don't last long as a cave explorer if you ignore your instincts. And my instincts were telling me something was very wrong. But there was something else, something stronger pulling me forward. The singing was so beautiful, so human in that vast, inhuman darkness. I thought maybe there was another entrance, that perhaps some church group had come in from another direction. It seemed impossible, but less impossible than the alternative. I followed the sound deeper. The passage narrowed, then opened into a series of chambers connected by crawlways. I had to remove my pack and push it ahead of me through some sections, my helmet scraping against the ceiling. All the while, the singing continued, never getting louder or softer, maintaining that same impossible, perfect clarity. Amazing grace, how sweet the sound, that saved a wretch like me. The words echoed off the limestone, and I found myself unconsciously mouthing them as I crawled. That's when I started seeing the names. Someone had carved them into the cave walls, dozens of them, maybe hundreds. They were old, carved with intention and care. I stopped to examine them more closely, running my fingers over the grooves. Cohen, 1952. Brielle, 1952. Alley, 1952. They all had the same year, all carved in the same style. Some had dates, too. March 3rd appeared over and over again. I photographed several of them, my hands starting to shake slightly as I held the camera. The singing had never stopped, and now I could make out individual voices in the harmony. A strong tenor, several soprano voices, a bass line that provided foundation to the whole thing. I counted at least 20 distinct voices, all blending together in perfect church harmony. The kind of singing that comes from years of practice, from people who've stood side by side every Sunday morning and know exactly how their voices fit together. The passage opened into a large chamber, and I stood up gratefully, my knees aching from crawling. My headlamp swept across the space, revealing something that stopped my breath. The walls were covered in carvings, hundreds of names and dates, all from 1952, all from March. But there was more. Someone had carved crosses, and beneath them what looked like a crude map or diagram. I moved closer, trying to make sense of it, when I realized what I was looking at. It was a map of the cave system itself, showing passages I hadn't explored yet, showing the chamber I was standing in. The singing was coming from the far end of the chamber, where another passage led deeper. It was so clear now, so close that I could hear them taking breaths between phrases. I once was lost, but now am found, was blind, but now I see. I called out, my voice cracking from hours of silence. Hello? Is someone there? The singing stopped. Not gradually, not trailing off the way music naturally ends. It just stopped, mid-word, as if someone had flipped a switch. The silence that rushed in to fill the space was so complete, so absolute, that I could hear my own heartbeat pounding in my ears, could hear the blood rushing through my veins. I stood frozen, my headlamp pointing toward the far passage, waiting for a response, for any sound at all, nothing, just that terrible pressing silence. I called out again, louder this time. Hello, I'm with the Geological Survey. Is anyone there? My voice echoed back to me, mocking and hollow. The echoes faded, and still, there was nothing. No footsteps, no whispered conversation, no sounds of movement at all. Just the kind of silence that exists in places where sound has never lived. I should have left then. Every instinct I had was screaming at me to turn around and get out of that cave as fast as I could. But I'm a scientist, trained to look for rational explanations, and I convinced myself there had to be one. Maybe it was wind moving through the passages in a way that created sound. Maybe there was some geological explanation, some acoustic phenomenon I didn't understand. I needed to know. I moved toward the far passage, where the singing had been coming from. My hands were shaking now, making my headlamp beam dance across the walls. The passage was narrow but tall, like a crack in the earth that had been widened by water over millennia. About 20 feet in, I found more carvings. These were different, more desperate somehow. The letters were deeper, more violent. "We can't get out" was carved over and over again. "Flood came too fast." "God help us." "Tell our families." And then, most disturbing of all, carved in letters 6 inches tall, "We're still singing." That's when I heard it again. Not singing this time, but a sound like a breath being drawn, magnified 1,000 times. It came from deep in the passage ahead of me, from somewhere far below where I stood. It was the sound of something massive, inhaling, pulling air through countless tons of stone and earth. And in that breath, I heard the echo of voices, faint and far away, forming the beginning of a word I didn't want to hear finished. I ran. I'm not ashamed to admit it. I turned and ran back through that chamber, squeezing through the crawlways without even bothering with my pack, scraping my shoulders and knees against the stone. I climbed that chimney faster than I've ever climbed anything, my muscles burning, not daring to look down. I followed my reflective tags back through the main passage, my headlamp picking them out in the darkness, my breath coming in ragged gasps that echoed around me. When I finally emerged from the cave entrance, the sun was setting, painting the Kentucky sky in shades of orange and red. I collapsed in the leaves outside, gulping fresh air, my whole body shaking. I sat there for probably 20 minutes before I could even think about gathering my equipment. My pack was still down there, along with most of my documentation. I didn't care. I wasn't going back. Later, I did what I should have done before I ever entered that cave. I researched the area, dug through old newspaper archives and county records. On March 3, 1952, a small Pentecostal congregation from a nearby hollow had gone into those caves for a baptism ceremony. There was an underground stream, apparently, that they considered sacred. 23 people went in. A freak rainstorm hit that afternoon, the kind of torrential downpour that Kentucky gets sometimes in early spring. The cave flooded. None of them made it out. The entrance they'd used had collapsed in the flood, and by the time rescuers found another way in, it was too late. The article said that for weeks afterward, people reported hearing singing coming from the hills, hymns echoing from underground. I never filed my report. I told the university the cave was unstable, not worth the risk of further exploration. I don't know if I heard the voices of those people, somehow trapped in stone and time, endlessly singing their last hymn. I don't know if it was some natural phenomenon, some trick of acoustics, an underground wind that I'm not educated enough to understand. What I know is this. When I called out, the singing stopped. Whatever was down there, it heard me. It knew I was there. And in that final breath, I heard before I ran, I swear it was trying to sing my name. I still have the photographs I took of those carved names. Sometimes I look at them and try to convince myself there's a rational explanation for everything I experienced. But then I remember that silence, that terrible expectant silence that rushed in when the singing stopped. And I know that some questions are better left unanswered. Some caves should stay unmapped, and some songs should never be heard by the living. My name is Margot, and I've worked in timber acquisition for almost a decade. It's not glamorous work, but it's honest. I drive through back roads, negotiate with landowners, assess properties for sustainable logging potential. I've dealt with stubborn farmers, hostile property owners, and more than a few folks who've run me off with shotguns. But nothing in my career prepared me for what happened in the summer of 2016, when my company sent me into the mountains along the Pisgah National Forest border in North Carolina. Some places don't want to be found, and some people are meant to stay hidden. The assignment seemed straightforward enough. An elderly landowner named Ezekiel had contacted our company about potentially selling timber rights to a portion of his property. The acreage listed in the county records was modest, maybe 40 acres of old-growth forest, but the location was promising. My boss handed me a folder with the basics, a property survey from 1967, tax records, and a hand-drawn map with directions. No phone number. Ezekiel had sent everything by mail, his handwriting shaky but legible. "Come on the 15th, his letter said. "I'll be expecting you." I left Asheville early that morning, my GPS programmed, with the approximate coordinates from the survey. The drive should have taken maybe 90 minutes, winding up through the mountains on roads that got progressively smaller and less maintained. I had my laptop, my surveying equipment, and copies of all the paperwork. Everything I needed for a standard site visit and negotiation. I remember the morning was beautiful, that particular kind of Appalachian summer morning where the mist hangs in the valleys and the mountains look like they're floating. The GPS lost signal about 45 minutes in, which wasn't unusual that deep in the mountains. I switched to following Ezekiel's hand-drawn map. His directions were specific. Take Route 215 to an unmarked dirt road just past a creek crossing. Follow it for 3 miles. Turn left at a lightning-struck oak. Continue until you see a stone cairn, then follow the trail on foot. I found the dirt road easily enough, marked just like he'd described. The creek was there, crossed by a narrow bridge that looked like it had been built during the Depression. But after that, things started feeling wrong. I followed the dirt road, counting the miles on my odometer. 3 miles came and went. No lightning-struck oak. I drove another 2 miles, thinking maybe I'd miscalculated, but the road just kept winding deeper into increasingly dense forest. I turned around, drove back slowly, examining every tree. Nothing matched his description. I pulled over and checked the map again, comparing it to my topographical survey. According to both, I should be right on top of the turnoff. I tried 4 more times, driving that same stretch of road back and forth, and each time it looked slightly different. I know how insane that sounds. Roads don't change, but I swear, the curves weren't in the same places, the trees seemed to shift position, and landmarks I'd noted on earlier passes had vanished. A distinctive rock formation I'd used as a reference point simply wasn't there on my 3rd pass. By the 4th attempt, I was questioning my own sanity, wondering if I'd somehow gotten on the wrong road entirely. Then I saw it. The lightning-struck oak, massive and dead, split down the middle like God had taken an axe to it. It was exactly where it should have been, but I knew, I absolutely knew, it hadn't been there on my previous passes. I sat in my truck for a full minute, hands gripping the steering wheel trying to rationalize what was happening. Maybe I'd been distracted, missed it before. Maybe the angle of the sun had made it less visible. I was making excuses and I knew it. The turn was right there, a narrow track that looked more like a game trail than a road. I shifted into 4-wheel drive and started up it, my truck rocking over roots and stones. The forest pressed in on both sides, branches scraping against my doors. My phone had no signal, obviously, but I'd downloaded offline maps before leaving. Except when I checked them, they showed nothing but blank green space. No roads, no trails, no property markers. Just forest, as if the place I was driving through didn't officially exist. The stone cairn appeared after about 20 minutes of careful driving, exactly as he'd described it. A pile of weathered stones stacked deliberately beside the trail, covered in moss and lichen that suggested it had been there for generations. I parked and continued on foot, carrying my briefcase and tablet. The trail was clear enough, winding between massive, old-growth trees that had to be centuries old. Oaks and hickories with trunks so wide, 3 people couldn't have linked hands around them. The kind of trees that shouldn't exist anymore, not on private land, not anywhere outside protected forests. That's when I started noticing the markers. They were subtle, easy to miss if you weren't looking for them. Stones painted with faded symbols, marks carved into tree bark, arrangements of branches that seemed too deliberate to be natural. They reminded me of the old boundary markers my grandfather used to show me on his property, the kind mountain people used before official surveys. But these seemed older, stranger. Some of the symbols didn't match anything I'd learned in my surveying courses. The cabin appeared suddenly, nestled in a clearing that somehow felt both natural and deliberately hidden. It was old, built from hand-hewn logs that had weathered to silver gray, with a stone chimney and a porch that sagged gently in the middle. Smoke rose from the chimney despite the summer heat. A dog barked once, then went silent. Ezekiel was sitting on the porch in a rocking chair, waiting, as if he'd known the exact moment I would arrive. "Miss Margot," he said, not asked. "You found your way." I hadn't told him my first name in any of our correspondence. The company letterhead just had my initials, M. Chen, Acquisition Specialist. But I smiled and approached, extending my hand. "Ezekiel, pleasure to meet you. Thank you for reaching out to our company." He didn't shake my hand, just nodded toward another chair. "Sit. You had trouble with the roads." Again, not a question. He was old, older than I'd expected, with skin like tanned leather and eyes that seemed to look through me rather than at me. His hands were gnarled with arthritis, but they moved with surprising steadiness as he poured water from a pitcher into 2 glasses. The directions were, "The roads are confusing up here," I said carefully, accepting the water. It was cold and tasted faintly of minerals, like it had come from a spring. "I'm glad I found you eventually." "The land knows who belongs," he said simply. "Takes some folk longer to get here than others. Your grandmother would have found it faster. She knew these mountains." My blood went cold. "I'm sorry, what?" "Your grandmother, Samantha, born Samantha Pritchard, up in Madison County. She knew these hills before she moved away, married that Chinese fellow, moved to California." He rocked slowly, his chair creaking. "You've got her eyes. Mountain eyes." I hadn't mentioned anything about my family, and my grandmother had died when I was 12. She had been from North Carolina, had grown up in these mountains before World War II, but that information wasn't in any of my professional records. It certainly wasn't something this man should have known. "How did you—" I started, but he held up a hand. "The land remembers. Your grandmother walked these hills as a girl, picked berries where your truck is parked now. The land remembers her, and it remembers you through her." He said it like it was the most natural thing in the world, like forests had memories and family histories written in their roots. I should have left right then. Every professional instinct I had was screaming that something was deeply wrong, but I was paralyzed, caught between disbelief and a creeping sense that he was telling the truth. I had my grandmother's eyes. She used to tell me stories about growing up in these mountains, about knowing the woods like her own home, about places that didn't appear on maps. "Ezekiel," I said, forcing my voice to stay steady and professional, "I'm here to discuss the timber rights to your property. According to county records, you own approximately 40 acres adjacent to the Pisgah National Forest. Is that correct?" He smiled, and there was something sad in it. "County records are wrong. Been wrong since they started keeping them. My family's been on this land since before there were counties, before there were surveys. The land decides its own boundaries." I opened my briefcase, pulled out the survey maps and tax documents. "These records show your property was surveyed in 1967, and before that in 1923. The boundaries are clearly marked, 40 acres, more or less." "More," he said. "Much more. The land gives and takes as it sees fit. Sometimes it's 40 acres. Sometimes it's 400. Sometimes it doesn't exist at all, not to people the land doesn't want finding it. You found it because your grandmother's blood gives you passage. But those timber companies you work for, they'll never find their way here. The land won't allow it." He wasn't speaking metaphorically. I could see it in his eyes, hear it in the absolute certainty of his voice. He genuinely believed the forest itself was alive, aware, actively protecting his property from outside intrusion. It was insane. Except I'd just spent 2 hours getting lost on a straight road, and he'd known things about my grandmother that should have been impossible to know. "Ezekiel, why did you contact my company if you don't want to sell timber rights?" "Didn't say I don't want to sell, said they'll never find their way here to harvest. But you found your way. You could come back. The land might allow it. Might allow your people if you're the one leading them. Your grandmother's blood is a bridge. The temperature seemed to drop, despite the summer heat. The forest around the clearing was absolutely silent. No birds, no insects, no rustle of leaves. Just that oppressive, watchful silence that made the hair on my arm stand up. I need to see the property boundaries, I said, standing up. I need to verify what you're claiming before I can report back to my company. He nodded slowly. Walk the land. You'll see the markers, but be back before dark. The land is kind to you now, but it doesn't like people wandering after sunset. I spent the next 3 hours walking his property, following the boundary markers he'd described, and with each step, my understanding of reality bent further. The markers were there, painted stones and carved trees, following a perimeter that should have been impossible. I tracked them with my GPS, watching the coordinates spiral outward in ways that defied the topographical maps I carried. According to my measurements, his property encompassed at least 200 acres, possibly more. Sections of the boundary disappeared into terrain so dense I couldn't follow, places where the forest seemed to actively push back against intrusion. I found survey stakes, official ones with metal tags, scattered throughout the property. But they were wrong. The dates were right. 1967, 1923, even one from 1889. But their positions made no sense. Some were hundreds of yards outside where they should have been according to official records. Others were in locations that didn't match any survey I'd ever seen. It was as if multiple surveys had been conducted on different versions of the same property, each one recording different boundaries. And then I found something that made me stop breathing. A survey marker with my company's logo on it, dated 3 weeks in the future. August 2016. It was weathered, partially overgrown, as if it had been there for months or years. But I was holding paperwork showing today's date was July 15th, 2016. The marker shouldn't exist, couldn't exist, unless time itself worked differently on this land. I ran back to the cabin. Ezekiel was still on the porch, rocking, as if he hadn't moved at all. "What is this place?" I demanded, my professional composure completely shattered. "What's happening here?" "Old land," he said simply. "Been in my family for 8 generations, and we were just caretakers for what was here before. Some places don't want to be part of the modern world. The land chooses to stay separate, and my family, we respect that choice. We protect it." "By doing what?" "Making people get lost, manipulating space and time." "We don't do anything. The land does it. We just live here, tend it, make sure the wrong people don't force their way in. Every few years, I reach out to timber companies, developers, whoever's pushing closest to our boundaries. Send them someone who'll get turned around on the roads, who'll report back that the property doesn't exist or isn't worth the trouble. Keeps people from looking too hard." He fixed those penetrating eyes on me. "Didn't expect you, though. Didn't expect someone with mountain blood still working for companies that want to tear up these hills." "My grandmother left these mountains," I said quietly. "She had her reasons. She did. But she never forgot them. And the mountains never forgot her, or her kin. You felt it, didn't you? The land recognizing you. That's not something that happens for outsiders." I had felt it. That was the worst part. Somewhere during that hike, the disorientation had faded, replaced by a strange sense of familiarity, like I was walking through a place I'd known in dreams. The markers had been easy to find once I stopped fighting against the wrongness and just followed my instincts. My grandmother used to tell me about that, about letting the mountains guide you instead of fighting them. "I can't report any of this," I said finally. "My company will think I'm insane. The survey data makes no sense. The coordinates are impossible." "Then tell them the property isn't viable. Tell them the access is too difficult. The old man won't sell, whatever you need to say. They'll move on to easier targets, they always do." He stood slowly, joints creaking. "But you'll come back. Maybe not next month or next year, but eventually. The land has recognized you, and you've recognized it. That doesn't go away." I left before dark, following the trail back to my truck. The drive out was easy, eerily so. Every turn was exactly where it should be, every landmark clear and obvious. The lightning-struck oak stood sentinel at the junction, and the dirt road led me straight back to the highway without a single wrong turn. It was as if the land had decided I'd passed some test and was allowing me safe passage. I filed a report saying the property was unbuildable due to terrain issues, and that the landowner had declined to sell. My boss accepted it without question. The file was closed, and my company moved on to other acquisitions. I never told anyone what really happened up there. But Ezekiel was right about one thing. I did come back. Not for my company, but for myself. 3 times over the next year, I drove into those mountains, following directions that somehow made sense to me now. Each time, the land let me through. Each time, I walked those impossible boundaries, trying to understand what I'd found. Ezekiel would be on his porch, rocking, unsurprised by my arrival. We'd talk about my grandmother, about the old ways of knowing mountains, about land that chose its own destiny. He died in the spring of 2018. I know because the forest told me, in ways I couldn't explain to anyone who hasn't walked those hills. I drove up one morning and knew, before I reached the cabin, that he was gone. There was a letter waiting for me on the porch, written in that shaky handwriting, dated the day before he died. It said simply, "The land knows you now. Watch over it when you can. Let it stay hidden." Your grandmother would have understood. I still have the survey data from that day, stored on an encrypted drive that I'll never share with anyone. Maps that show boundaries shifting, coordinates that contradict themselves, timestamps that don't make sense, evidence of something that shouldn't exist, but does. I've stopped trying to rationalize it. Some places operate by older rules than the ones we've invented, and some land chooses to remain outside our understanding. The county still lists that property as 40 acres owned by the estate. But I know better. I know that somewhere in the mountains, along the Pisgah National Forest border, there's a place where the trees remember who walked beneath them, where the land itself decides who may enter and who will wander lost until they give up. And I know that my grandmother's blood gave me passage to something most people will never see. A reminder that these mountains were old and wild and strange long before we tried to measure and own them. Sometimes I wonder if I should try to protect that land officially, get it designated as protected forest or historical property. But I think Ezekiel was right. The land doesn't need our protection. It's been protecting itself just fine for longer than we've been keeping records. All it needs is for people like me to know it exists, to respect its boundaries, and to let it remain hidden from those who would try to change it into something ordinary. The mountains keep their secrets, and now I keep them too. My name is Caleb, and I've never believed in ghosts. Growing up in West Virginia, you hear the stories constantly. Every hollow has its haunts, every old house its spirits, every stretch of mountain road its warnings about what walks at night. I always figured they were just stories, the kind of folklore that grows in isolated places where people have too much time and too little company. But in April of 2021, I spent 3 nights in my grandmother's cabin in the Monongahela National Forest, and what I saw standing in the rain changed everything I thought I knew about what stays behind when we die. My grandmother passed that February. She was 93, sharp as a tack until the very end, and stubborn as they come. She'd lived alone in that cabin for 40 years after my grandfather died, refusing every offer to move closer to family, insisting the mountains were where she belonged. We respected that, even though it meant she was 2 hours from the nearest hospital and completely alone for weeks at a time during the worst winter weather. When she finally went, it was peaceful. She died in her sleep in the cabin she loved, and we found her 3 days later when she didn't answer her weekly phone call. The family decided to sell the property. None of us wanted to maintain a place that remote. And honestly, none of us could imagine living there without her. It felt wrong, like we'd be occupying a space that was so completely hers that even her absence would be more present than we could ever be. But before we could list it, someone had to go through her things, sort out what to keep and what to donate, clean the place up for potential buyers. I volunteered. I was between jobs, had the time, and I'd always been close to her. It seemed right that I should be the one to handle it. I drove up on a Thursday afternoon in mid-April. The weather forecast called for rain, which wasn't unusual for that time of year in West Virginia. Spring in the mountains means mud season, when the winter snow melts and the spring rains come, and everything turns into a soggy mess for weeks. I packed accordingly, bringing rain gear and boots, figuring I'd spend a few days working through her belongings while listening to rain on the metal roof. It seemed almost fitting, actually. My grandmother had loved rainy days, said they made the forest come alive. The cabin sat in a clearing about a mile off the main forest road, accessible only by a rutted track that required four-wheel drive even in good weather. It was small, maybe 800 square feet, with a bedroom, a main room that served as kitchen and living area, and a bathroom my grandfather had added in the 70s. No internet, no cell service, just a landline that was supposed to work but didn't half the time. The clearing around it was maybe 50 yards across before the forest closed in. Thick stands of oak and maple and hemlock that seemed to press in from all sides. My grandmother used to say the trees were protective, that they kept her safe from whatever might wander through. I'd always thought she was being poetic. I arrived around 4 in the afternoon, and the rain started an hour later. Not a gentle spring shower, but a heavy, relentless downpour that turned the clearing into mud and made the forest disappear behind sheets of water. I spent the evening going through her kitchen cabinets, boxing up dishes and canned goods, trying not to think too much about the fact that these were things she'd touched, used, lived with. Every object had her presence in it somehow. A chipped mug she'd drunk her morning coffee from. A wooden spoon worn, smooth by decades of use. Recipes written in her careful handwriting, stained with ingredients and time. It was around 10 that night when I first saw the figure. I'd been washing dishes at the kitchen sink, looking out the window at the rain-soaked darkness, when movement caught my eye. Someone was standing at the tree line, maybe 40 yards from the cabin, just standing there, motionless, facing the cabin. I couldn't make out any details through the rain and darkness, just a shape, a human silhouette darker than the surrounding night. My first thought was that someone else was on the property, maybe a hiker who'd gotten lost or was seeking shelter from the storm. I grabbed a flashlight and opened the front door, shining the beam toward where I'd seen the figure. The rain was coming down so hard it was difficult to see more than 20 feet, but I swept the light across the tree line. Nothing. No one. Just trees and rain and darkness. I called out anyway, shouting over the sound of the downpour, asking if anyone was there, if they needed help. No response, just the constant roar of rain on leaves and earth. I stood there for maybe 5 minutes, getting soaked, sweeping the flashlight back and forth. Finally, I convinced myself I'd been mistaken, that the darkness and rain and my own tiredness had created shapes where none existed. I went back inside, changed into dry clothes, and told myself to stop being paranoid. But I kept looking out the windows, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something had been there, watching. The rain continued all night, a steady pounding that made sleep difficult. I lay in my grandmother's bed, in the room where she died, listening to water hammer the roof and wondering why I'd volunteered for this. The cabin felt emptier than empty, like her absence had created a vacuum that even sound couldn't properly fill. Around 3 in the morning, I got up to use the bathroom, and without really thinking about it, I looked out the window that faced the clearing. The figure was there again. Closer this time, maybe 25 yards from the cabin, standing in the open clearing in the pouring rain. Still motionless, still facing the cabin. I could see it more clearly now, despite the darkness and rain. A person, definitely a person, wearing what looked like a long coat or dress, old-fashioned in cut. Standing there as if the rain didn't exist, as if standing in a torrential downpour at 3 in the morning was the most natural thing in the world. I felt ice run down my spine. This wasn't imagination. This wasn't tiredness or darkness playing tricks. Someone was out there, had been out there for hours, standing in conditions that should have driven anyone to seek shelter. I grabbed my phone, forgetting for a moment that there was no service, then remembered the landline. I picked it up. Dead. The storm must have knocked out the line. I should have been frightened, should have barricaded myself in the cabin and waited for dawn. But instead, I felt something else. Anger, maybe, or indignation. This was my grandmother's property, my family's property, and someone was out there doing something that felt deeply wrong. I pulled on my rain gear and boots, grabbed the flashlight, and stepped out into the storm. The rain hit me like a physical force, cold and heavy. I swept the flashlight toward where I'd seen the figure, and for a moment, I saw it clearly. A woman in a long, dark dress, the kind women might have worn 50 or 60 years ago. Her hair was down, plastered to her head by the rain, and she was standing completely still, arms at her sides, face turned toward the cabin. Toward me. The flashlight beam caught her for maybe 3 seconds before she simply vanished. Not walked away, not moved into the trees. Just disappeared, as if she'd never been there at all. I stood frozen in the rain, my flashlight illuminating nothing but trees and falling water. My rational mind was screaming that this couldn't be happening, that people don't just vanish, that there had to be an explanation. But my gut, that ancient part of the brain that knows when something is deeply wrong, was telling me to get back inside and lock the door. I listened to my gut. I spent the rest of the night sitting at the kitchen table with all the lights on, watching the windows, waiting for dawn. The rain never stopped, never even slowed. It was like the sky had opened up and decided to wash the mountains clean. I thought about my grandmother's stories, the ones I'd dismissed as folklore. She used to talk about things that walk the hollows, about presences in the forest that weren't quite human but weren't quite anything else either. I'd always assumed she was repeating old tales, the kind of stories Appalachian people tell to explain the strange and the unknown. It had never occurred to me that she might be speaking from experience. Dawn came gray and sodden, the rain still falling in unrelenting sheets. I made coffee with shaking hands and tried to convince myself that I'd imagined everything, that the stress of dealing with my grandmother's death, combined with being alone in an isolated cabin during a storm, had created hallucinations. It almost worked. Almost. I spent that day going through her bedroom, boxing up clothes and personal items, trying to stay focused on the task at hand. But I kept looking out the windows, kept watching the tree line, waiting to see if the figure would appear in daylight. It didn't. The forest remained empty, or at least appeared empty. The rain continued without pause, turning the clearing into a shallow lake and the access road into what I knew would be an impassable mud pit. I wasn't leaving until the storm broke, whether I wanted to or not. That second night was worse. I saw her much earlier, around 8 o'clock, when there was still a faint gray light in the sky. She was closer again, maybe 15 yards from the cabin, standing in the same motionless pose. I could see more details now. The dress was definitely old-fashioned, probably from the 1960s or 70s, dark fabric that clung to her from the rain. Her face was pale, though I couldn't make out features clearly, and she was staring directly at the cabin, directly at me where I stood at the window. This time, I didn't go outside. I closed the curtains, turned on every light in the cabin, and tried to pretend I was anywhere else, but I could feel her out there, feel her presence like a weight against the walls. The rain seemed to grow louder, more insistent, as if it too was demanding my attention. I turned on my grandmother's old radio, finding a station that came in crackling and weak, just to have some sound besides the endless rain. Around midnight, I made the mistake of looking out the window again. She was right outside, maybe 5 feet from the glass, staring in. I could see her face clearly now despite the rain and darkness, and recognition hit me like a physical blow. I knew that face. I'd seen it in photographs, in the albums my grandmother had kept of her younger days. The woman standing in the rain, soaked and pale and impossibly present, was my grandmother. Not as I'd known her, not the 93-year-old woman who died 2 months ago, but young. Maybe 30 years old. The age she would have been in the 1950s or 60s when she'd first come to this cabin with my grandfather. I stumbled backward from the window, my mind refusing to process what I was seeing. Ghosts weren't real. Dead people didn't come back. And even if they did, why would my grandmother be standing in the rain, staring at her own cabin with an expression I couldn't read? Was it longing, confusion, warning? I couldn't tell. I only knew that every instinct I had was screaming that this was wrong, that whatever was outside wasn't really my grandmother, couldn't be, even if it wore her face. I spent that night huddled on the couch, all the lights blazing, jumping at every sound. The rain continued its relentless assault, and I swear I could hear footsteps on the porch, slow and deliberate, pacing back and forth. But every time I worked up the courage to look, there was nothing there. Just rain and darkness and the terrible certainty that I was being watched. The third morning came, and with it a hazard decision. Storm or no storm, passable roads or not, I was leaving. I'd pack up what I could fit in my truck, lock the door behind me, and let someone else deal with the rest. I didn't care if I had to abandon the truck on the access road and walk the last few miles to the highway. I was done. Whatever was happening here, whatever my grandmother had lived with, or become, or invited, I wanted no part of it. But as I started throwing things into boxes, moving with frantic urgency, I noticed something I'd missed before. On my grandmother's nightstand, beneath a stack of books, was a journal. Her handwriting, recent entries dated just days before she died. I opened it, and the first page I saw stopped me cold. "It's been coming closer," she'd written, "every night for the past week. I know it's me, or what I was, or what I'll be. I'm not afraid. The mountains keep their own, and I've always known I'd stay here. When my time comes, I'll walk into the rain and join what's waiting. The trees remember everyone who's loved them. They give back what we give them. I gave them 50 years. They'll keep me forever." The entries went back weeks, describing the figure in the rain, documenting its nightly approach. My grandmother had known it was coming, had known it was her, and had welcomed it. She'd written about the old beliefs, about how places like this, deep in the mountains, far from the modern world, operated by different rules, about how people who truly belonged to the land didn't entirely leave it when they died. They stayed in some form, walking the places they'd loved, watching over what they'd claimed as home. I read through tears, understanding finally what I'd been seeing. It wasn't haunting me. It wasn't threatening. It was just my grandmother, or the part of her that belonged to these mountains, checking on her home one last time, making sure it was cared for, making sure I understood something she'd tried to teach me my whole life, but I'd been too skeptical to hear, that some places are alive in ways we don't understand, and some people become part of those places so completely that death doesn't sever the connection. That third night, I didn't close the curtains. I sat at the kitchen table with a cup of my grandmother's tea, made the way she'd taught me, and waited. The rain continued softer now, more like a regular spring rain than the deluge of the previous nights. Around 10 o'clock, she appeared at the tree line. Still young, still wearing that dark dress, but her posture was different. Less rigid, almost relaxed. I went to the door and opened it, standing on the porch where the roof kept off the rain. She was closer now, maybe 10 yards away, and I could see her face clearly in the porch light. She looked peaceful, and she was smiling slightly, the same smile I remembered from my childhood when I'd done something that pleased her. We stood there for a long moment, separated by rain and distance, and the barrier between living and dead, and I understood that this was goodbye. The real goodbye we hadn't gotten when she died in her sleep. I understand now, I said aloud, not caring how crazy it seemed to talk to a ghost. You're part of this place. You always were. I'll make sure whoever buys it treats it right. Treats you right. She nodded just once, and then she turned and walked into the trees, not vanishing this time, just walking, moving deeper into the forest until the darkness and rain swallowed her. I stayed on the porch until dawn, and the rain finally stopped as the sun came up, the first clear sky in 3 days. I spent another week at the cabin, going through everything carefully, respectfully, understanding now that I was handling more than just possessions. I was handling the artifacts of a life lived in deep connection with a place, and that meant something. When I finally locked the door for the last time, I left flowers on the porch and whispered another goodbye. We ended up not selling the cabin. My cousin, who'd always loved the mountains, decided to keep it in the family, to come up on weekends and maintain it. She says she's never seen anything unusual, but sometimes on rainy nights she hears footsteps on the porch. She doesn't mind. She says it feels like my grandmother checking in, making sure the place is loved. And maybe that's exactly what it is. I still don't know if I believe in ghosts, not in the traditional sense, but I believe that some people leave impressions on places, and some places keep those impressions alive in ways we don't understand. I believe my grandmother loved that cabin and those mountains so much that some part of her refused to leave. And I believe that's not haunting. It's home. And maybe in the end, that's all any of us want. To be remembered by the places we loved. To leave some mark that says we were here, we mattered, we belonged. The mountains keep their secrets, and they keep their people too, if those people gave themselves fully enough. My grandmother did, and now she walks in the rain, through forests she knew better than any map could show, watching over a cabin that was more truly hers than any deed could prove. And on rainy nights in April, if you're very quiet and very patient, you might see her standing at the tree line, checking on what she protected in life and protects still in whatever comes after. Just don't be afraid. She means no harm. She's just making sure the mountains remember, and are remembered in turn. My name is Jennifer, and I've been a professional land surveyor for 12 years. I've mapped everything from suburban subdivisions to remote wilderness areas, and I've learned to trust 2 things above all else: my equipment and my observations. Technology doesn't lie. GPS coordinates don't shift. Survey markers stay where you place them. But in October of 2018, I spent 5 days in the Cherokee National Forest in Tennessee, and everything I thought I knew about time and space fell apart. I was contracted by the Forest Service to conduct a boundary survey of a remote section near the North Carolina border. The area hadn't been properly surveyed since the 1960s, and they needed accurate modern documentation. It was a solo assignment, camping in the backcountry, working along approximately 15 miles of boundary line. Standard wilderness surveying work. Nothing I hadn't handled before. I hiked in on a Monday morning in mid-October. The forest was beautiful, all steep ridges and deep hollows covered in oak and hickory turning gold and red. I found the beginning of the old survey line without difficulty, marked by a weathered concrete monument from 1967. From there, I began working along the boundary, taking GPS readings, photographing landmarks, placing new markers. The first day went perfectly. The second morning, I found a survey stake that hadn't been there the day before. I'd passed through this exact area, had even stopped for water at the distinctive lightning-scarred tree right next to where the stake now stood. I would have seen it. The stake was hand-hewn chestnut wood, clearly old, but somehow appearing freshly placed. I checked my photographs from the previous day. The spot where the stake now stood showed bare ground. Nothing. The stake had appeared overnight. Over the next few hours, I found 3 more stakes, all chestnut, all newly placed in locations I'd already surveyed. Each time, my photographs confirmed they weren't there yesterday. By noon, I was thoroughly unsettled, but I kept working, documenting everything. That afternoon, things got stranger. I found boot prints in mud along the creek, fresh prints showing hobnails or cleats, the kind of footwear from the early 20th century. The prints followed the same survey line I was working, moving in my direction. I called out thinking maybe it was a Forest Service employee. No response. I followed the prints for 50 yards before they ended at bare rock. No prints leading away. They just stopped, as if whoever made them had vanished. That night, reviewing my GPS data, I noticed something impossible. Some waypoints had timestamps from October 14th. Today was October 9th. October 14th was 5 days in the future. I checked both my GPS units. Both showed the correct date, but the waypoints were time-stamped from dates that hadn't happened yet. The third day, I found an old surveyor's transit set up on a ridge. Brass and wood, 19th century equipment, in perfect condition. It was properly leveled and aimed along the boundary I was surveying. I looked through the eyepiece and saw survey markers across the valley, cloth flags on poles set at regular intervals. I stepped back and looked with my naked eye. Empty ridgeline, just trees. I looked through the transit again, and the markers reappeared. The instrument was showing me things from a different time. Near the transit, I found a notebook in a leather case. Old survey notes, calculations, sketches. The handwriting was elaborate, clearly done with ink pen. I flipped through pages of historical survey data, and then the handwriting changed, became modern, became mine. I was reading my own future survey notes, dated October 11th through 14th, documenting work I hadn't done yet. My own handwriting in a notebook that appeared to be over 100 years old. I should have left right then, but I needed to understand, to document, to prove I wasn't losing my mind. I photographed everything, the transit, the notebook, the impossible GPS data. I wrote detailed notes describing what I was seeing. Over the next 2 days, the phenomenon intensified. I'd see someone ahead of me, working with old surveying equipment, wearing clothes from another era. When I called out or approached, they'd vanish behind a tree. And when I reached that spot, no one was there. Just more of those period boot prints, always exactly 1 day fresher than my own tracks. I kept finding my own notes scattered through the forest, pages torn from a notebook matching mine, documenting work I would do tomorrow. Each time, I'd later write exactly what I'd already read, fulfilling some temporal loop I couldn't escape. The most disturbing moment came on day 5, when I found a survey marker with my initials dated October 13th. I was supposed to finish on the 12th and leave, but here was evidence I would still be here, that the future was already written, and I was following a script I'd somehow already performed. That night, I considered whether I'd had a psychotic break, but the evidence was tangible. The photographs were real. The GPS data was recorded. I couldn't dismiss it as mental illness. I thought about time, about how we understand it as linear, moving in one direction. But what if that's wrong? What if time, in certain places under certain conditions, becomes non-linear? The Cherokee National Forest had been surveyed countless times over 200 years. Maybe something about the act of surveying had worn thin the barrier between those different time periods. Maybe I was seeing the accumulated history of this place, all the surveys that had ever been conducted, existing in overlapping layers of time. On my 6th day, I found myself unable to leave. I needed to see one more thing. I hiked to the location where I'd found the marker dated October 13th, and I placed my own marker there, dated and initialed exactly as I'd seen it, fulfilling the loop, becoming the surveyor I'd been following. And as I drove that final stake, I saw him, saw myself, standing 50 yards away, wearing the same clothes, holding the same equipment, looking back at me with the same expression of confused terror I knew was on my face. Then he turned and walked behind trees and didn't emerge. I walked to that spot and found boot prints, my boot prints, but showing where mine wouldn't show for another week. I was looking at my own future tracks while standing in my present. I hiked out that evening, reaching my truck after dark. I drove straight to my office, not stopping, not sleeping. I spent 3 days writing reports. One was clean and professional, documenting boundaries and coordinates. The other detailed everything I'd experienced, with photographs and GPS data to support it. The Forest Service accepted the first report and quietly filed the second. I got paid, got thanked, and never heard another word about the anomalies. When I asked if they'd experienced anything similar, the supervisor said, "Some sections of the forest don't follow standard rules. We've learned to work with that. The surveys get done, and sometimes the process is stranger than we can explain. Best to document what you can and move on." I've done other surveys since then. None have been like that week in Cherokee National Forest, but I carry that experience with me. I'm not just measuring present-day land. I'm walking where hundreds of surveyors walked before me, adding my measurements to layers of history that stretch back centuries. And in some places, those layers overlap. They intersect. They bleed through. I still have that notebook with my own future notes. I've kept it as evidence, though evidence of what I'm not sure. Sometimes I read my handwriting, documenting work I remember doing, but that was somehow already done before I did it. It's proof that time isn't as simple as we pretend, that the past isn't really gone, and the future isn't really pending. In some places, they're all happening at once. I don't take solo assignments anymore, not because I'm afraid, but because some experiences are too strange to process alone. And if I ever get called back to Cherokee National Forest, to that remote section near the North Carolina border, I'll decline. Some surveys, once completed, don't need repeating. The boundaries are marked now, in multiple timelines apparently, and that should be enough. My name is David, and I don't consider myself a religious man. I was raised Presbyterian, went to church until I was old enough to make my own choices, and then I just stopped. It wasn't rebellion or a crisis of faith, just a quiet disinterest in organized religion. I found my spirituality in hiking, in the mountains and forests, where I could think clearly and feel connected to something larger than myself without needing hymns or sermons to mediate that connection. That worked fine for 32 years, until June of 2017, when I took shelter from a storm outside Gatlinburg and found myself trapped in a church that shouldn't exist, with a congregation that drowned 40 years ago, reenacting the last moments of their lives. I'd been hiking the trails around the Smoky Mountains for a week, doing a solo trek through some of the less traveled areas outside the national park boundaries. The weather had been perfect until that Sunday afternoon in mid-June, when the sky suddenly darkened and the temperature dropped 15 degrees in minutes. Anyone who knows mountain weather recognizes the signs of a serious storm building, and I'd been caught in enough of them to know better than to be on an exposed trail when lightning started. I was maybe 5 miles from the nearest official trailhead, following an old logging road that wound through second-growth forest. The first drops started falling, big and heavy, and within 60 seconds, it went from sprinkles to torrential downpour. Thunder cracked overhead, close enough that I felt it in my chest, and I knew I needed shelter immediately. Through the curtain of rain, I spotted a building maybe 100 yards off the trail, partially hidden by trees. It looked abandoned, which was perfect. I didn't care what it was as long as it had a roof. I ran toward it, my boots splashing through rapidly forming puddles, my pack bouncing against my back. As I got closer, I could see it was a small white church, the kind you see scattered throughout Appalachia. Simple wooden structures built a century ago to serve rural congregations. The white paint was peeling, the steps looked rotten, and several windows were broken, clearly abandoned. I took the steps 2 at a time, pushed open the door, and stepped inside out of the rain, and walked straight into Sunday service. The church wasn't abandoned at all. It was full of people, maybe 40 or 50 of them, sitting in the pews facing a pulpit where a preacher stood mid-sermon. Every head turned to look at me as I stood dripping in the doorway, and the preacher stopped speaking. For a long moment, there was absolute silence except for the sound of rain hammering the roof. Then the preacher smiled, warm and welcoming. "Come in, son. Come in out of the storm. You're among friends here." His voice had that particular cadence of old-time Southern preachers, musical and assured. The congregation murmured agreement. Friendly voices calling out greetings, telling me to find a seat, that I was welcome. I stood frozen, completely disoriented. The building had looked abandoned from outside. Now it was full of people, the interior clean and well-maintained, candles burning on the altar. I mumbled an apology for interrupting and moved toward an empty space in the back pew. As I walked down the aisle, I started noticing details that didn't fit. The people were dressed strangely. Not modern clothes, but not quite costume either. The women wore dresses with hemlines from the 60s or 70s, their hair styled in ways I recognized from old photographs. The men wore suits that looked outdated, narrow ties, and wide lapels. Everyone looked slightly out of time, like I'd walked into a historical reenactment. The hymnals in the pew rack were old, the covers worn and water-stained. I picked one up and flipped through it. The printing style looked vintage, and penciled in the front cover was a date, 1969. I set it down carefully and looked around more closely. The church interior was clean, but showed signs of age, wear patterns that suggested decades of use. Yet from outside it had looked abandoned and derelict. The preacher resumed his sermon. "We were speaking of judgment," he said, his voice filling the small space. "Of being washed clean. Of how the Lord uses water to purify and test his faithful. Noah and the flood. Moses and the Red Sea. Baptism in the Jordan. Water is the Lord's tool, brothers and sisters. It washes away sin, but it can also wash away the sinner." The congregation murmured, "Amen," and "Preach it, brother." I sat quietly, increasingly uncomfortable, but telling myself I'd just wait out the storm. The sermon continued, the preacher's voice rising and falling in that rhythmic pattern of evangelical oratory. He talked about floods, about being tested, about faith in the face of rising waters. It should have felt like a coincidence, storm outside and a sermon about floods inside, but something about it felt deliberate, scripted. After maybe 10 minutes, I noticed the temperature had dropped. I could see my breath. The candles on the altar flickered despite there being no draft, and I realized I couldn't hear the storm anymore. The rain that had been pounding the roof had gone silent. I looked at the windows, trying to see outside, but they showed only darkness, as if it were night rather than late afternoon. I stood up quietly, intending to slip out the door. Several people in the pews turned to look at me, and their faces held the same warm smiles. But there was something off about them now. Their eyes didn't quite match their smiles. The preacher paused in his sermon. "Leaving so soon, son? The service isn't finished. Please sit. The service must finish." It wasn't a request. The way he said it, the way everyone was looking at me now, made it clear that leaving wasn't an option. I sat back down slowly, my heart starting to race. Something was very wrong. I just couldn't articulate what it was. The sermon continued. "In 1973, the rains came," the preacher said, and I noticed his voice had changed. Less performative now, more personal, almost conversational. "March of 1973, the Lord sent the waters to test us. This church, this congregation, we gathered here on a Sunday morning just like this one. We sang hymns, we prayed, we listened to the word, and the waters rose." The congregation had gone absolutely still. No one was moving. They were all staring forward at the preacher, with expressions I couldn't read. Memory, resignation, fear. "The creek overflowed," the preacher continued. Flash flood, they called it later. 15 feet of water in 15 minutes. The doors wouldn't open. The windows were too small. We were trapped here, all of us together, singing hymns as the water rose, singing even as it reached our knees, singing as it reached our waists, singing until our mouths went under and we had no breath left to sing. Ice ran down my spine. I looked around the church with new eyes. The water stains on the hymnals, the wear patterns on the walls, high up, where water would have marked them. The old-fashioned clothes weren't costumes. They were what these people had been wearing on the last day of their lives. I tried to stand again and found I couldn't. My legs wouldn't respond. The preacher looked directly at me. "The service must finish, son. We've been finishing this service for 44 years now. Every time the storm comes, every time someone takes shelter here, the service must finish." That's when I felt the water. Cold, rising up from the floorboards, seeping through my boots. I looked down and saw it pooling around my feet, dark and muddy, rising with impossible speed. I could move now, but when I tried to reach the door, I found people blocking the aisle, still smiling, still watching me with those dead eyes. "Sing with us," the preacher said, and the congregation opened their hymnals. They began singing "Amazing Grace," their voices perfect and terrible, harmonizing in ways that made the hair on my arm stand up. The water was at my ankles now, rising steadily, cold enough to make my feet ache. I pushed past the people in the aisle, not caring anymore about being polite. They were solid at first, then seemed to fade slightly as I moved through them, like pushing through cold fog shaped like people. The water was at my knees. I reached the door and grabbed the handle. It wouldn't budge. Locked or stuck, I couldn't tell. The windows were too small to climb through, and when I looked out them, all I saw was water. Dark, rushing water pressing against the glass. The congregation kept singing, their voices never wavering, even as the water reached their waists, their chests. The preacher stood at his pulpit, water lapping at his shoulders, still conducting the hymn with one raised hand. "The service must finish," he said again. "It always finishes. The water always comes. We always sing. That's our task, son. Our eternal task. To finish the service we never got to finish." The water was at my waist, shockingly cold, and I could feel the current trying to pull my feet out from under me. I braced myself against the door, looking for any way out, any escape from this impossible situation. The singing continued. Perfect harmony, from people who'd been dead for decades, who drowned in this church and somehow never left, trapped in a loop of their final moments. Then I saw it. A small window high on the wall, above the water line, just barely large enough for a person to fit through. It was broken, the glass long gone. I splashed toward it, climbing onto a pew as the water swirled around me. The congregation watched but didn't stop me. They just kept singing, their faces barely above the water now, their eyes still fixed on me. I pulled myself up to the window and squeezed through, scraping my shoulders on the frame, not caring. I fell through onto wet grass outside, landing hard, and scrambled to my feet. The storm had stopped. The sky was clearing. Late afternoon sun was breaking through the clouds. I turned to look at the church. It was exactly as it had appeared when I first saw it. Abandoned, derelict, windows broken, paint peeling. The door hung open on broken hinges. Through the doorway, I could see the interior, empty and covered in decades of decay. Water-stained walls, collapsed pews, no people, no candles, no sound. I walked back toward it on shaking legs, knowing I shouldn't but needing to see. I climbed the rotted steps carefully and looked inside. The church was a ruin. The floor was covered in mud and debris. Old hymnals were scattered and moldering. There was no sign that anyone had been here in decades, but on the wall near the door, I found a plaque. Weathered brass, barely legible. In memory of the congregation of Little Creek Baptist Church, lost in the flood of March 18th, 1973. The Lord called them home during Sunday service, 47 souls. I didn't remember the walk back to the trailhead. I just remember my truck suddenly being there, and me sitting in it with the engine running and the heat on full blast, still shivering from cold that had nothing to do with temperature. When I got back to my hotel in Gatlinburg, I looked up the flood, found newspaper archives from 1973. Flash flood, March 18th, Sunday morning. A small church in a hollow outside town. The creek overflowed its banks, 15 feet of water in minutes. The entire congregation was inside for Sunday service. None of them made it out. The church was destroyed in the flood, condemned, and supposedly demolished a few years later. Supposedly. But it's still there, in some form, in some version of reality that overlaps with ours when conditions are right, when the storm comes, when someone seeks shelter. The service continues. The congregation sings. The water rises. And they try to make you stay, try to make you finish the service with them, because maybe if enough people complete the service they never got to complete, they can finally rest. I don't hike alone anymore, and I never ever take shelter in abandoned buildings during storms. I'd rather be soaked to the skin and risk lightning than risk finding another place where the dead are still going through motions they can't escape, reenacting their final moments in an endless loop of tragedy and devotion. Some services should never finish, some hymns should never be sung, and some churches should stay empty, memorials to loss rather than prisons for souls who can't move on. But I wonder sometimes, on stormy Sunday afternoons, if they're still there, still singing, still waiting for the service to end so they can finally go home. And I wonder if the preacher is still welcoming lost hikers out of the rain, offering shelter that becomes a trap, trying to add new voices to a choir that's been singing the same hymn for 44 years. I hope no one else finds that church. I hope the forest eventually swallows it completely, and the congregation can finally stop singing and find whatever peace comes after endless repetition. But I suspect they'll keep singing as long as the rains come and the church stands. Some prayers, once started, echo forever. My name is Thomas, and I've been a forest ranger in the Great Smoky Mountains for 11 years. I've dealt with poachers, illegal campers, lost hikers, and the occasional idiot trying to take selfies with bears. Nothing in that experience prepared me for what I encountered in February of 2020, when I investigated reports of illegal logging in a protected old-growth section near the North Carolina-Tennessee border. I found a logging crew working in complete darkness and absolute silence, felling trees with tools that haven't been used in over a century, speaking in a dialect I could barely understand, and when I tried to stop them, they simply vanished, leaving behind work that shouldn't have been possible. The first report came from a through hiker who'd gotten off trail trying to find a water source. He claimed he'd heard trees falling in the middle of the night in an area where no logging was permitted, where old-growth forest had been protected since the park was established. I filed it as a possible misidentification of natural tree fall, which happens regularly in winter storms. But then a second report came in, and a third, all describing the same thing, sounds of logging activity at night in protected areas. I decided to investigate personally. The location was remote, accessible only by hiking several miles from the nearest service road. I went in on a Thursday afternoon in mid-February, planning to camp overnight and see if anything unusual occurred after dark. The area was beautiful, untouched forest, with trees that had to be 300 or 400 years old. Massive oaks and chestnuts, the kind of trees that survived because the original logging operations couldn't reach this particular hollow. I made camp about a quarter mile from where the hikers had reported the activity, setting up in a position where I could observe without being obvious. As darkness fell, the temperature dropped into the 20s. I settled into my sleeping bag with thermals on, prepared for a long, cold, probably boring night of surveillance. Most illegal activity reports turn out to be nothing, just sounds misinterpreted or wildlife doing wildlife things. Around midnight, I heard it. The unmistakable sound of a tree falling, that particular crack and crash that's impossible to mistake for anything else. I grabbed my flashlight and radio and headed toward the sound, moving carefully through the darkness. As I got closer, I heard it again. Another tree falling, and another. But something was wrong. I couldn't hear chainsaws, couldn't hear voices or machinery or any of the normal sounds that accompany logging operations. I emerged into a small clearing and stopped, my flashlight beam catching something that made no sense. Trees were down, freshly felled, and there were men working, at least a dozen of them, moving through the darkness with impossible coordination, handling tools I recognized from historical exhibits. Two-man crosscut saws, broad axes, wedges, and mauls. They were working in complete darkness, no lights at all, moving with perfect precision as if they could see clearly in the pitch black. I stood frozen, watching them work. They moved like a choreographed dance, each man knowing exactly where the others were, working in perfect synchronization. One team would fell a tree with a crosscut saw. The tree would fall exactly where they intended, and immediately another team would move in to limb it with axes. All of this happening in darkness so complete I could barely see them even with my flashlight. I finally found my voice. "This is a federal ranger. You're conducting illegal logging in a protected area. Stop what you're doing immediately." My voice sounded wrong in the silence, too loud, too modern. The men didn't stop, didn't even acknowledge me. They just kept working, their movements never faltering. I moved closer, my flashlight beam sweeping across them. They were dressed in old-fashioned work clothes, heavy wool and canvas, nothing modern. Their tools were antiques, hand-forged and well-used, and their faces, when the light caught them, were wrong somehow. Not frightening exactly, just wrong. Too pale, too still, expressions that didn't quite match the physical exertion they were performing. I said, "Stop," I shouted, moving toward the nearest man. He was using a broad axe to remove limbs from a downed tree, his movements precise and economical. I reached out to grab his shoulder, and my hand passed through cold air. He was solid to my eyes, but somehow not entirely there, like he existed in a space slightly offset from my reality. That's when one of them finally spoke. He straightened up from his work, a tall man with a beard and clothes that looked like they were from the late 1800s. His voice was strange, the accent thick and archaic, using words I recognized but in patterns that sounded foreign. "Ranger man, we mean ye no harm. We's just working our trees same as we always done." "These aren't your trees," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "This is protected federal land. No logging is permitted here. You need to leave immediately." He looked at me with eyes that held something like pity. "Been working these trees since before there was rangers or federal land. Been working them since before we died, truth be told. Still working them now. Can't seem to stop, see? Can't seem to rest." The other men had paused in their work now, all of them watching me with those strange, too still faces. One of them spoke up, his dialect even thicker. "Company man said we had to clear this section. Said we wouldn't get paid lest we cleared it all. We cleared it, but we never got paid. We died clearing it. Accident with the flume. Washed most of us downstream. Bodies broke on rocks and trees." My mind was racing, trying to process what I was hearing. I'd studied the history of the Smokies, knew about the logging operations that had devastated these mountains in the late 1800s and early 1900s, knew about the lumber companies that had worked thousands of men in brutal conditions, the accidents that killed dozens every year, the labor practices that were barely better than slavery. "When did this happen?" I asked, though I already knew the answer would be impossible. 1894, the tall man said. "February. We was trying to get one more load out before the spring thaw made the flume too dangerous. Foreman pushed us to work faster. Flume broke, water and logs and men all mixed together. 18 of us died. They didn't even stop operations to bury us proper. Just kept cutting, kept working, treated us like we was no more important than the trees we felled. I looked around at the clearing, at the freshly cut trees, at the men who were and weren't there. "You're ghosts," I said flatly, because there wasn't any other word for it. "Reckon so," the tall man agreed. "Reckon we died with the work unfinished and can't seem to let it go. Every night we come back, cut the trees we was supposed to cut, clear the section we was told to clear, but come morning, the trees is standing again, and come next night, we're back cutting them down, over and over. Can't seem to finish, can't seem to stop." The horror of it settled over me. Not the jump scare kind of horror, but the deep existential kind. These men were trapped in an endless loop of the labor that had killed them, unable to rest, unable to stop, forced to repeat their final days forever. The trees they cut down reappeared because they were cutting down ghost trees, echoes of the forest that had been destroyed over a century ago. "How do I help you?" I asked, because what else was there to say? I couldn't arrest ghosts, couldn't stop them from working, but maybe I could do something to help them find peace. The tall man shook his head slowly. "Don't reckon you can, Ranger man. We's bound to this work same as we was bound to it in life. Company owned us then, and somehow it owns us still. Maybe if the company had paid us what they owed, maybe if they'd buried us proper, maybe if someone had acknowledged what was done to us. But nobody did, and now we're stuck." Another man spoke up, younger, his voice bitter. "They cut every tree in these mountains, stripped them bare, left nothing but stumps and mud. Thousands of men died doing it, and ain't nobody remembers. Ain't nobody cares that we died making rich men richer, died so city folk could have their lumber and their paper and their money." I looked at these men, these ghosts of labor exploitation, and felt a grief that went beyond their individual tragedy. They represented thousands of workers who'd been used up and discarded by the lumber companies, whose deaths were recorded as statistics if they were recorded at all, whose names were forgotten along with the forests they destroyed. "I care," I said quietly. "I'll remember. I'll tell people what happened here, what was done to you." The tall man smiled sadly. "Appreciate that, Ranger man, but it won't change nothing for us. We'll still be here come next night cutting trees that ain't really there, working for wages we'll never see. That's our lot, seems like. Maybe it's punishment. Maybe it's just how death works when you die angry and cheated." They turned back to their work, picking up their tools, resuming the synchronized movements. I watched them for a long time, standing in the cold darkness, my flashlight beam casting shadows that moved wrong. Eventually, I walked back to my camp, my mind struggling to process what I'd witnessed. The next morning, I returned to the clearing. The trees they'd cut down were standing again, untouched, no sign of any logging activity. No stumps, no sawdust, no evidence that anything had happened. I spent the day documenting everything, taking photographs, writing detailed notes that I knew would sound insane if anyone ever read them. That night, I watched again, and sure enough, as midnight approached, they appeared. The same men, the same tools, the same impossible work in perfect darkness. I tried talking to them again, asking more questions about their lives and deaths, about the lumber companies and the conditions they'd worked under. They answered when they could, between the rhythm of their labor, painting a picture of exploitation and casual cruelty that was historically accurate, but still horrifying to hear described in such personal terms. I stayed for 3 more nights, documenting everything, recording their stories. On the last night before I hiked out, the tall man stopped working long enough to approach me. "You'll forget most of this," he said matter-of-factly. "People always do. Too strange to hold in a modern mind. You'll remember something happened, but the details will slip away like water through fingers." "I won't forget," I insisted. "I'm writing everything down." "You'll try," he said kindly. "We appreciate that you'll try. But the world don't want to remember what was done here. Don't want to acknowledge that all this beauty was built on bones and blood. Easier to think of these mountains as eternal and peaceful, not as a crime scene that's been slowly healing for 100 years. I did write it all down. Submitted a report that was carefully worded to sound almost sane, describing possible echo phenomena and historical reenactment sightings that might be mistaken for paranormal activity. My supervisor read it, raised an eyebrow, and filed it away without comment. I've gone back to that clearing several times since, always at night, always in winter. The logging crew is still there, still working, still trapped in their endless labor. I've tried researching the specific incident they described, but records from that era are sparse and unreliable. Lumber companies didn't keep careful track of worker deaths, and many accidents went unreported entirely. I found references to a major flume accident in February of 1894 that killed multiple workers, but no names, no details, nothing that would help me identify these specific men or honor their memory properly. So I do what I can. I tell their story, even though most people think I'm speaking metaphorically or telling campfire tales. I make sure hikers understand that these mountains aren't just pretty views and hiking trails, but places where thousands of people lived and worked and died, often under terrible conditions. I talk about the lumber companies and the environmental devastation and the human cost of America's industrial expansion. And sometimes, on winter nights when I'm alone in these mountains, I think about those men still working in the darkness, still cutting ghost trees with ghost tools, still waiting for wages that will never come and rest that remains out of reach. They're a reminder that some injustices echo beyond death, that exploitation can bind souls as effectively as it bound bodies, and that the beautiful forests we protect today grew back over wounds that never fully healed. The trees stand tall again now, but underneath, if you know how to look, you can still see the scars. My name is Rebecca, and I'm a wildlife biologist specializing in black bear populations in the southern Appalachians. I've spent 15 years studying animal behavior, analyzing migration patterns, setting up trail cameras in remote wilderness areas. I understand ecosystems, predator-prey relationships, the interconnected web of life that makes a forest function. But in September of 2019, I discovered something in Jefferson National Forest that doesn't fit any biological model I know. I found a valley that breathes. Not metaphorically, not as some poetic description of natural cycles, but literally. The entire hollow rises and falls like a massive chest-drawing breath, and my cameras captured something beneath the soil that shouldn't exist. I was conducting a long-term study on bear denning behavior in a remote section of Jefferson National Forest in southwestern Virginia. The area was perfect for my research, isolated and difficult to access, with minimal human traffic and healthy bear populations. I'd identified a hollow about 6 miles from the nearest service road that showed promising signs of bear activity. My plan was to set up a grid of trail cameras throughout the valley to monitor movement patterns over the course of several months. I hiked in on a Tuesday morning in mid-September, carrying camera equipment, batteries, and mounting hardware. The weather was perfect, cool and clear, with that particular quality of early fall light that makes everything look crisp and defined. The hollow itself was beautiful, a narrow valley maybe half a mile long and a few hundred yards wide, enclosed by steep ridges on 3 sides. Old-growth oaks and hickories dominated, with a small creek running down the center. Exactly the kind of place bears would use for denning come winter. I started setting up cameras at the mouth of the hollow, working my way deeper into the valley. Each camera required careful placement and calibration, and I used a handheld GPS unit to record exact coordinates for later reference. The 4th camera I installed about a quarter mile into the hollow gave me the first indication that something was wrong. I mounted it to a tree, stepped back to check the angle, and then verified the GPS coordinates. Elevation showed 2,147 feet. I made a note and moved on to the next location. 20 minutes later, I was setting up camera number 5 maybe 50 yards away when I happened to check my GPS again. The elevation reading showed 2,151 feet. That made sense. The terrain sloped gently upward, but then I noticed something odd. I was looking at my previous waypoint, the location of camera 4, and its elevation had changed. It now showed 2,149 feet, 2 feet higher than when I'd recorded it 20 minutes earlier. I stood there, staring at the GPS, assuming it was a malfunction. Elevation readings can drift slightly due to atmospheric pressure changes, but 2 feet in 20 minutes was impossible. I walked back to camera 4 to verify. When I reached it, the GPS showed I was at 2,049 feet. Definitely not the 2,047 I'd recorded. I marked it down as equipment error and made a mental note to recalibrate when I got home. Over the next 3 hours, I set up the remaining cameras, creating a grid pattern that covered most of the hollow. I was so focused on the technical work that I didn't pay attention to the GPS anomalies that kept occurring. It wasn't until I sat down by the creek for lunch that I started reviewing my data and noticed the pattern. Every single waypoint I'd recorded had changed elevation since I'd marked it. Some were higher, some lower, but all of them had shifted by 2 to 4 feet. And the changes seemed to be happening in a rhythm, higher, then lower, then higher again. I spent my lunch break taking continuous elevation readings from a fixed position. I marked a spot on a rock and stood there, watching the GPS. Over the course of 10 minutes, the elevation reading fluctuated from 2,734 feet to 2,738 feet and back again. A 4-foot variance while standing completely still. That was an equipment error. That was impossible unless the ground itself was moving. I looked around the hollow with new awareness, trying to see if I could detect any physical movement. The trees were still, no wind to speak of. The creek burbled along unchanged. Everything looked completely normal, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was fundamentally wrong with this place. I decided to stay through the afternoon and monitor the cameras, see if they captured anything unusual. As the afternoon wore on, I started noticing other oddities. The trees in the valley seemed to sway slightly even when there was no wind. Not random movement like you'd expect from individual trees responding to breeze, but synchronized swaying. All the trees moving together, rising slightly and then settling back down. The movement was subtle, maybe just a few inches, but once I started looking for it, I couldn't unsee it. I set up a time lapse on my phone, propping it against a rock facing a grove of oaks. I let it record for 30 minutes, then reviewed the footage in fast motion. What I saw made my skin crawl. The entire grove rose and fell in perfect unison, a rhythmic pattern that repeated every few minutes. Rise, hold, fall, hold, rise, hold, fall, hold, like breathing, like the entire valley was inhaling and exhaling. I should have left right then, packed up my gear, and hiked out while there was still daylight. But scientific curiosity overrode caution. I needed to understand what I was seeing. I needed data. I decided to stay overnight, let the trail cameras record, and see what they captured during hours of darkness. I made camp near the mouth of the hollow close to my exit route and settled in for the night. As darkness fell, the temperature dropped quickly, and I huddled in my sleeping bag, eating a cold dinner, watching the shadowy forms of trees against the dimming sky. That's when I first felt it. Not saw it, felt it. The ground beneath me rose slightly, held for maybe 15 seconds, then settled back down. The movement was small, maybe 3 or 4 inches, but unmistakable once I was paying attention. I lay there in my sleeping bag, eyes wide open in the darkness, feeling the earth breathe beneath me. Rise and fall, rise and fall. A slow, steady rhythm that never varied. I tried timing it with my watch. Each breath cycle took approximately 4 minutes, 15 breaths per hour. The mathematics of it somehow made it worse, more real, more impossible to dismiss as imagination. Sleep was out of the question. I spent the night listening to the forest, hearing sounds I couldn't identify, feeling the ground move in that terrible slow rhythm. When dawn finally came, I packed up immediately and started checking my trail cameras. The first few showed normal footage, deer moving through, a raccoon investigating the camera, the usual forest activity. But camera 7, the one positioned in the deepest part of the hollow, had captured something that made my blood run cold. The footage showed the forest floor moving. Not just the gentle rise and fall I'd observed, but significant displacement. The soil and leaf litter bulged upward in a pattern that looked organic, intentional. And beneath the surface, visible in the infrared footage, something massive was moving. The heat signature was enormous, spread across the entire frame, and it showed what looked like ribs, huge curved structures beneath the soil, expanding and contracting with each breath cycle. I watched the footage 3 times, my hand shaking. This wasn't multiple animals. It wasn't any kind of geological activity I could explain. It looked like the entire hollow was a living thing, and what I'd thought was a valley was actually some kind of organism so large that trees grew on its surface, so old that it had become indistinguishable from the landscape itself. I pulled the memory cards from all 11 cameras, not bothering to retrieve the cameras themselves. I just wanted the data, and I wanted out. As I worked my way back through the hollow, I paid attention to details I'd missed before. The trees weren't just old. They were positioned in patterns that suggested ribs. The creek followed a path that looked like it might trace a massive spine. The ridge lines enclosing the valley had a curvature that was too symmetrical, too purposeful. At camera 7, where I'd captured the footage of movement beneath the soil, I knelt down and dug into the leaf litter with my hands. 6 inches down, I hit something that wasn't rock or root. It was smooth and slightly warm, with a texture like bark, but denser, harder. I cleared away more soil and found what looked like bone, except it was covered in a thin layer of living wood, as if the thing beneath had been slowly incorporating the forest into itself, or the forest had been growing from it. I backed away, slowly, feeling sick. This entire hollow, this beautiful valley I'd chosen for my research, wasn't a valley at all. It was something alive, something so massive and so old that it had become part of the mountain itself, and I'd been sleeping on it, walking on it, setting up cameras to monitor the wildlife that lived on its surface like parasites or symbiotes on skin. I hiked out faster than I've ever moved through wilderness, not quite running, but close. I didn't feel safe until I was back at my truck, miles away, with the engine running and the heater on full blast, even though it was 60 degrees outside. I drove straight home, 5 hours without stopping, my mind trying and failing to process what I'd discovered. The footage from the cameras was even more disturbing when I reviewed it on my computer. Camera 7 wasn't the only one that had captured movement beneath the soil. Cameras 5, 6, 8, and 9 all showed similar patterns. The entire center section of the hollow was moving in synchronized rhythm, rising and falling, the heat signatures showing massive organic structures beneath the surface. One piece of footage, from camera 8, showed what looked like an eye opening briefly in the soil, though that might have been my interpretation of something I didn't understand. I spent weeks trying to find rational explanations: geothermal activity, gas pockets, unusual root systems. But none of it fit the data. The movement was too regular, too biological. The heat signatures were too consistent with living tissue. And my GPS logs, when I analyzed them carefully, showed that the entire hollow had been fluctuating in elevation by 3 to 4 feet throughout the day I was there, in a rhythm that matched respiratory patterns. I never filed my research from that location. I told my supervisor the site wasn't suitable and moved my study to a different area. But I kept the footage, kept the data, kept my notes. I've looked at maps of Jefferson National Forest, trying to identify other locations that might show similar characteristics. There are 3 hollows within 50 miles that have the same basic shape, the same symmetrical ridge lines, the same two perfect curves. I've tried researching folklore from the area, looking for stories about living mountains or breathing valleys. I found a few references in old Appalachian tales about places that shouldn't be disturbed, about hollows where people disappeared or went mad, but nothing specific enough to confirm what I found or explain what it might be. The question that haunts me isn't what it is, exactly. The question is how many of them there are. How many valleys and hollows throughout these mountains are actually ancient organisms, so old and so large that they've become indistinguishable from the landscape? Are they remnants of something from before human history, before recorded time? Or are they something that was always here, that we've been walking on and building on without knowing, mistaking living things for geology? I still work in Jefferson National Forest. I still set up trail cameras and track bear populations, but I'm more careful now about where I choose to work. I check topographic maps for valleys that look too symmetrical. I pay attention to whether trees in an area sway in unison. And I never, ever camp in a hollow that feels like it's breathing. Some research questions don't need answers. Some discoveries should be left alone. Because if I'm right, if those valleys are alive, then we've been living on them, cutting them, building roads across them, all while they've been sleeping or dormant or simply tolerating our presence. And I don't want to be there if they wake up. My name is Ember, and I spent exactly 87 days as a fire lookout in Chattahoochee National Forest during the summer of 2015. I took the job thinking it would be a peaceful retreat, a chance to disconnect from the world and spend 3 months alone in the mountains with nothing but books and my thoughts. Instead, I spent those 87 days learning why the previous lookout died of dehydration while surrounded by water, why he refused to come down from the tower even as his body shut down. I learned because the voices started calling my name from the forest below, and I learned to recognize them, and I learned that they weren't trying to lure me down at all. I'd just finished a rough breakup and lost my teaching job in the same month. When I saw the posting for a seasonal fire lookout position, it seemed perfect. 3 months of solitude in a tower, watching for smoke, reading books, getting paid to be alone. No ex-boyfriend, no job stress, no social obligations, just me and the mountains and silence. I applied, got accepted, and in early June found myself hiking up to a fire tower on a remote peak in northern Georgia. The tower was old, built in the 1940s. A metal structure with a small cabin at the top accessed by a narrow staircase that wrapped around the outside. The cabin was maybe 10 by 10 feet, with windows on all sides, a desk, a cot, a propane stove, and a radio. Water came from a spring about 50 feet down the trail. Solar panels powered basic electricity. It was Spartan but functional, and the view was incredible. Miles of unbroken forest in every direction, ridge after ridge, fading into blue distance. The ranger who showed me the ropes was brief and professional. He explained the radio protocols, showed me how to use the firefinder, demonstrated the water filtration system. As he was leaving, he paused at the door and said, "Previous guy lasted 3 months. Died up here in April. Dehydration. Strange because the spring never runs dry, and he had plenty of water stored. Medical examiner figured maybe he had a mental break, forgot to drink. Just thought you should know." I thanked him for the information, not thinking much of it. People died in isolated places sometimes. Accidents happened. I didn't realize he was trying to warn me without actually saying anything that might scare off another replacement they desperately needed. The first week was exactly what I'd hoped for. I woke with the sun, made coffee, scanned the horizon for smoke. I read books, journaled, watched weather patterns develop and dissolve. At night, I'd sit on the catwalk outside the cabin and watch stars appear as darkness fell. The only sounds were wind through trees and the occasional call of birds. It was peaceful in a way I hadn't experienced in years. On day 8, I found the notebook. It was shoved under the mattress on the cot. a standard composition book with water stains and a torn cover. I opened it, expecting to find fire reports or maintenance logs. Instead, I found diary entries from the previous lookout, written in increasingly erratic handwriting. The early entries were normal. Observations about weather, notes about wildlife, comments on the solitude. But around week 4, they changed. Heard someone call my name this morning. Sounded like my mother. She's been dead 3 years. I didn't go down to check. And then, a few days later, they know names now. They called me Dariel this morning. They called from multiple directions. I stayed in the tower. I flipped through more pages, watching the handwriting deteriorate, watching the entries get shorter and more desperate. Don't go down. They're not who they sound like. They know things only the dead would know. And near the end, out of food. Spring is right there. Can see it from the window. But I can't go down. They're waiting. They want me to come down so badly. They beg. They cry. They use her voice. They use all their voices. But I understand now. They're not trying to get me to come down. They're trying to keep me up here. Warning me. Something's down there. Something's in the forest. Better to die of thirst than find out what. The final entry was barely legible. Day 91. Can't swallow anymore. Mouth too dry. They're still calling, begging me to stay up. I understand. I'll stay. I'll die here rather than go down. Better this way. I sat on the cot holding the notebook, my hands shaking. This man, Dariel, had died because he believed voices in the forest were warning him about something. He'd chosen dehydration over descending the stairs. Mental illness, clearly. Isolation-induced psychosis. I should have radioed the ranger, reported finding the notebook, requested extraction. I didn't. I told myself I'd be fine, that I was stronger mentally, that I wouldn't let isolation break me. The voices started on day 12. I woke up just before dawn, that strange gray period when the world is barely visible, and I heard my name. Ember. Clear as anything, coming from the forest below. I looked out the window, but saw nothing. Just trees in pre-dawn darkness. I convinced myself I'd imagined it, still half asleep. But it happened again that night. Ember. Different voice this time. Younger. Female. I turned on my flashlight and shined it down into the forest. The beam barely penetrated 20 feet before being swallowed by darkness. Nothing moved. No one was there. I told myself it was animals, or wind, or my mind playing tricks in the isolation. On day 15, I recognized one of the voices. It was my sister. My sister who died when we were teenagers, drowned in a lake 20 years ago. Her voice, exactly as I remembered it, calling my name from the darkness. Ember. Ember, please. I stood at the window, my breath fogging the glass, listening to my dead sister call for me from a forest in Georgia, miles from where she died. I didn't go down. Something in her tone, in the desperation of it, made me remember the notebook. They're trying to keep me up here, warning me. I stayed in the tower, shaking, crying, listening to my sister's voice fade with the coming dawn. The voices multiplied after that. I heard my mother, my ex-boyfriend, childhood friends, my grandmother. All of them calling my name, sometimes pleading, sometimes sobbing, but always urgent, always desperate. I started paying attention to what they were actually saying, and I realized Dariel was right. They weren't trying to lure me down. They were begging me to stay up. Ember, don't come down. Please don't come down. Stay in the tower, Ember. It's not safe. Ember, we're trying to warn you. Don't leave. Don't leave the tower. I radioed the ranger station and tried to explain what was happening. The ranger on duty responded with concern, asking if I wanted extraction. I found myself saying no, telling him I was fine, making excuses. But the truth was, I needed to understand. I needed to know what was down there, what these voices were protecting me from, or warning me about, or maybe what they were protecting. I started watching the forest more carefully during the day, using binoculars, scanning the tree line, looking for anything unusual. On day 23, I saw a movement. Something large, moving through the forest in a way that wasn't quite right. Too fluid, too coordinated. Like multiple things moving as one, or one thing pretending to be multiple. It never came into full view, just shadows and movement at the edge of visibility. The voices got worse at night, dozens of them sometimes, all calling my name, all begging me to stay in the tower. I heard people I'd forgotten existed, elementary school teachers, neighbors from childhood, a boy I'd kissed once at summer camp. All of them somehow here, somehow using this forest to speak to me, to warn me. On day 35, I made the mistake of trying to get water. I'd run out, and the spring was only 50 feet away. 50 feet. I could run it. I descended the stairs quickly, telling myself I'd be fine. Just fill the containers and get back up. The voices started immediately, screaming now, no longer just calling my name, but shrieking, go back up, Ember, go back now. I was 20 feet from the spring when I saw it. Not clearly, just enough to know I was seeing something that shouldn't exist. Something that had been waiting in the trees, waiting for me to descend. It was large and wrong, with proportions that didn't match any animal I could name. I ran back to the tower, dropping my water containers, taking the stairs 3 at a time, hearing something behind me, something that breathed but not with lungs, something that moved but not with legs. I made it back inside the cabin and slammed the door, gasping, my heart trying to break through my ribs. The voices outside were screaming, celebratory almost. She's safe. She made it back. Ember made it back up. After that, I didn't try to go down again. I rationed the water, had left. I filtered what collected on the solar panels after rain. I survived on minimal hydration and no longer cared about food. The voices had saved me. Whatever was down there, they'd warned me. They'd scared me back up before it could reach me. I spent my nights reading Dariel's notebook over and over, understanding now what he'd gone through. He'd figured it out too. He'd realized the voices were warnings, not threats, and he'd chosen to die rather than face what waited below. On day 70, I finally radioed that I wanted extraction, not because I was ready to leave, but because I was running out of supplies and knew I'd die otherwise. The ranger who came up hiked in broad daylight, mid-afternoon, and he made it to the tower without incident. Whatever was in the forest seemed less active during full daylight. Or maybe it only targeted people who stayed, people it could wait for. He found me dehydrated, malnourished, barely conscious. As he helped me down the stairs in bright afternoon sun, the voices whispered blessings, relief, gratitude. She survived. Ember survived. Good luck, Ember. Stay away. Don't come back. I spent 2 weeks in a hospital recovering. The doctors diagnosed dehydration, malnutrition, and possible psychological breaks from isolation. I didn't correct them. I didn't try to explain about the voices or what I'd seen. Who would believe me? I didn't report what I'd found in the notebook or what I'd experienced. The Forest Service would just send another lookout, and maybe they wouldn't be lucky enough to hear the warnings. I've never gone back to Chattahoochee National Forest. I've never taken another job that requires isolation, but I think about those voices constantly. I think about who they were, or what they were. Were they people who'd gone down and been taken? Were they something older, using familiar voices to communicate warnings? Were they trapped between the tower and whatever lurked below, eternally trying to save whoever came next? I don't have answers. I just know that Fire Tower is still there, still staffed seasonally, and whoever takes that job will eventually hear their name called from the forest below, and they'll have to decide whether to listen to the warnings or ignore them, whether to trust the voices of the dead or trust their own rational mind that says voices in the forest can't be real. I chose to listen. Dariel chose to listen. We both survived, in our ways. But I wonder about the people who didn't listen, who heard their names called and went down to investigate, who thought they could handle whatever was there. I wonder if their voices are added to the chorus now, if they spend eternity calling warnings to the next person, trying to save someone else from the mistake they made. I wonder, but I'll never go back to find out. Some towers should stay empty, some jobs should go unfilled, and some forests should be left alone. My name is Andre, and I'm an urban explorer. I document abandoned places, photograph the ruins left behind when industries collapse and populations move on. I've explored hundreds of locations across the eastern United States, from shuttered factories to forgotten amusement parks. But in March of 2022, I visit an abandoned coal town in eastern Kentucky, and when I reviewed my photographs later that night, I found images I didn't take. Images showing me in the background, wearing mining clothes I'd never owned, covered in coal dust. With each photo, my double was closer to the sealed mine entrance, and in the final image, he was staring directly at the camera with a warning in his eyes that made me understand I was being pulled toward repeating a tragedy that happened 46 years ago. The town was called Harlan Ridge, though that name doesn't appear on any modern maps. It was a company town built in the 1920s by a coal operation that strip mined the surrounding mountains until there was nothing left worth extracting. The town was abandoned in stages as seams played out, but the final evacuation came suddenly in March of 1936 after a mine collapse that killed 23 men. The company sealed the mine entrance, paid out minimal settlements to families, and within 6 months, the town was completely deserted. Buildings were left standing, houses abandoned with furniture still inside, the company store left stocked with goods that would never be sold. It was an urban explorer's dream, a time capsule of 70s-era coal country. I drove in on a gray Tuesday morning, parking at what used to be the main road into town. The pavement had long since cracked and buckled, trees growing up through the asphalt, nature reclaiming what had been taken from it. I grabbed my camera bag and started walking, taking establishing shots of the approach, documenting the decay. The town appeared gradually through the trees, maybe 200 structures spread across a narrow valley. Company houses lined dirt roads, all identical, small wood frame buildings that had once been painted but were now uniformly gray with age and weather. The company store dominated the main street, a 2-story brick building with broken windows and a collapsed porch. Further up the valley, I could see the massive structures of the mine itself, the tipple and conveyor systems, rusting metal frameworks reaching into the cloudy sky. I spent the morning working my way through the residential area, photographing interiors where I could safely enter. Some houses still had dishes in the sink, clothes in closets, family photos on walls. The evacuation had been rushed, people taking only what they could carry, leaving behind lives they'd built in this isolated valley. It was eerie but fascinating, the way time had stopped in March of 1976 and then slowly decayed from there. Around noon, I made my way to the mine facilities. The main entrance had been sealed with concrete, a thick barrier with warning signs about instability and danger. The administrative buildings were still accessible, though, and I spent an hour photographing offices with paperwork still stacked on desks, time cards still hanging on their board, safety posters from the 70s warning about mine hazards. I took hundreds of photos that day, working methodically through the town, documenting everything. The light was perfect, overcast and diffuse, giving everything that particular quality that urban exploration photographers love. I felt good about the shoot, knew I had strong material for my website, and maybe an article pitch to one of the Urbex magazines. I drove back to my motel that evening and transferred all the photos to my laptop, settling in to review and edit. That's when I saw it. The first anomaly was in a photo I'd taken of the company store interior. I'd framed the shot looking down an aisle, collapsed shelving, creating interesting angles. In the background, visible through a doorway to what looked like a storage room, was a person. A man, wearing a hard hat and work clothes, partially obscured but definitely there. I stared at the image, confused. I'd been alone in that building. I checked carefully before entering, listened for any sounds of other explorers or squatters. There had been no one. I opened the next image in the sequence, taken maybe 30 seconds later from a slightly different angle. The figure was still there, but more visible now. And with a cold shock of recognition, I realized I was looking at myself. Same build, same posture, same jacket. Except I was wearing a hard hat and what looked like a miner's work clothes, covered in dark streaks that had to be coal dust. And in my hand was a lunch pail, the metal kind workers carried in the 70s. I checked my camera's metadata. The photo's timestamp matched when I'd been in the building. But I'd been alone. I hadn't seen anyone, hadn't seen myself, hadn't experienced anything strange. Yet there I was, in my own photograph, dressed like a miner from decades ago, standing in a room I hadn't entered. My hands were shaking as I clicked through more images. The next anomaly appeared in a photo of one of the administrative buildings. Through a window, barely visible, was that same figure. Me, in mining gear, this time standing outside the building, looking toward the sealed mine entrance. I hadn't been outside that building. I'd photographed it from across the road. Image after image, I found myself appearing where I hadn't been, always in the background, always in period clothing, always oriented toward the mine. In one photo, taken from the residential area looking downhill toward the mine facilities, I could see myself standing in the middle of the main road, facing away from camera, the mine entrance visible in the distance. The figure was distant, but unmistakable. The regression became clear as I worked through the chronological sequence. With each photo, my double was closer to the sealed mine entrance, moving from the town buildings, through the administrative area, past the equipment yards, approaching that concrete barrier. And the clothing was getting dirtier, more worn, the coal dust heavier. I reached the final batch of photos, the ones I'd taken at the mine entrance itself. I'd spent maybe 20 minutes there, photographing the sealed entrance, the warning signs, the rusted equipment surrounding it. I opened the first image and felt my stomach drop. Standing maybe 10 feet from the camera, directly in front of the sealed entrance, was myself. Full figure, unavoidable, clear as day. Wearing a miner's hard hat, work coveralls black with coal dust, holding that lunch pail, and staring directly at the camera. Directly at me. The expression on his face, on my face, was desperate. Eyes wide, mouth slightly open as if shouting a warning. One hand was raised, palm out, in a universal gesture of stop. Behind him, the concrete seal over the mine entrance looked wrong somehow. In the photo, it appeared cracked, crumbling, as if it had been breached or was failing. I zoomed in on the figure's face, and the detail was impossible. This wasn't a trick of light or a misidentified object. It was me, down to the scar on my left eyebrow from a childhood accident, down to the shape of my ears. But the expression was wrong. I'd never looked like that, had never felt the kind of terror I could see in those eyes. I checked the other photos from the mine entrance. In every single one, the figure was there, always in the same position, always with that same desperate expression, always trying to communicate something I couldn't hear. The last photo I'd taken just before leaving the mine area showed the figure closer, impossibly closer, as if he'd moved toward the camera after I'd turned away. His face filled more of the frame, and I could see that he was saying something, mouth-shaped around words I couldn't make out. I spent that night trying to rationalize what I was seeing. Double exposure, though my camera was digital and didn't work that way. Photoshop manipulation, except these were straight from my camera's memory card, unedited raw files. Someone following me dressed as me, which was absurd on every level. Psychotic break. Hallucination, some kind of mental health crisis that was manifesting in my perception of digital images. None of it explained what I was seeing. None of it explained why my double was dressed in clothing from the 70s, why he was oriented toward a mine that had been sealed since 1976, why he looked increasingly desperate in each subsequent image. I researched the mine disaster that had closed the town. March 12, 1976. A Friday. 23 men killed when a support structure failed and a section of the mine collapsed. 17 bodies recovered. 6 never found, trapped behind tons of fallen rock and coal. I found a newspaper article listing the victims. The names meant nothing to me until I saw one toward the end of the list. Manuel. Just Manuel, no last name recorded in the article I found. One of the 6 never recovered. A name that echoed strangely with my own. I looked at the photos again with this new information. My double in mining gear, covered in coal dust, moving toward the sealed entrance of a mine that had killed 23 men and trapped 6 bodies. Moving through my photos like he was trying to show me something, trying to warn me about something. I didn't sleep that night. I sat in my motel room staring at the images until my eyes burned, trying to understand what was being communicated. At 3 a.m, a thought occurred to me that made my blood run cold. What if this wasn't showing me the past? What if it was showing me the future? Some kind of temporal echo where I was seeing myself being drawn toward the mine, toward repeating whatever tragedy had happened there. I opened my laptop's calendar. March 10th, 2022. 2 days until March 12th. 2 days until the anniversary of the disaster. I looked at the final photo again, at my double standing at the sealed entrance with his hand raised in warning, and I understood. He wasn't beckoning me to the mine. He was trying to stop me from going there, trying to warn me away from something that would happen if I returned. But why? What would make me go back? I'd documented the town completely. There was no reason to return, no shot I'd missed that would justify another trip, unless I was being drawn there, pulled by something I didn't understand, some pattern or force that repeated itself, that found people with the right connection on the right day and led them into closed minds to repeat tragedies from decades before. I checked my GPS history, looked at the route I'd driven to Harlan Ridge. Without consciously deciding to, I'd taken several wrong turns, detours that had added time to my trip but had felt right somehow, as if something was guiding me there, making sure I arrived, making sure I was in position for whatever was supposed to happen. I spent March 11th in a panic, debating whether to drive further away or whether distance would even matter. I called a friend who was into paranormal investigation, tried to explain what was happening without sounding insane. He told me that some locations develop echoes, that tragedies can create patterns that repeat, drawing people into recreating historical events. He told me that if I felt pulled to go back, I should fight it, should do whatever it took to stay away until the anniversary passed. March 12th was hell. I felt a physical pull to drive back to Harlan Ridge, a certainty that I needed to be there, that there was something left to photograph, something important I'd missed. The feeling grew stronger as the day progressed, becoming almost unbearable by afternoon. I locked myself in the motel room, called my sister, and talked to her for hours. Anything to distract myself from the overwhelming urge to get in my car and drive back to that abandoned town. By evening, the pull had faded. Midnight came and went, and whatever force had been trying to draw me back to the mine released its grip. I sat on the motel bed shaking, knowing that I'd narrowly avoided something terrible, that if I'd given in and returned to that town on that day, I would have ended up at that sealed mine entrance, and somehow the seal would have been open, and I would have gone inside, and I wouldn't have come back out. I left Kentucky the next morning, drove straight through to Ohio before I felt safe enough to stop. I've never been back. I deleted all the photos from Harlan Ridge, scrubbed them from my camera and computer, wanted no record of what I'd seen. But I kept one. Just one. The final image of my double standing at the sealed entrance, with his hand raised in warning. I keep it as a reminder that some places are more than just abandoned buildings, that some tragedies echo forward in time, looking for someone to complete them again. I still explore abandoned places, but I'm more careful now. I check dates, research what happened at locations before I visit, avoid anniversaries of disasters, And I never, ever photograph abandoned mines. Some places should be left undocumented. Some ruins should be allowed to decay in private. Because sometimes, what gets captured in photographs isn't the past, but a future that's trying to happen. A pattern that's trying to complete itself, and all it needs is someone in the right place at the right time with the right connection to fall into step with history and repeat it one more time. My name is Lisa, and I'm a rational person. I have a degree in engineering, work as a systems analyst, trust data and evidence and reproducible results. I don't believe in supernatural phenomena or unexplained mysteries. Everything has a cause, an explanation, a logical framework. I believed that completely until November of 2020, when I drove through morning fog on the Blue Ridge Parkway in Virginia and discovered that fog doesn't always move naturally. Sometimes it holds a perfect boundary line, sharp as a knife edge, and everything on the other side exists in a different time period. I spent 6 hours driving through that fog, watching the world shift between decades, and I still can't explain what I experienced in any framework that makes rational sense. I'd been visiting a friend in Roanoke and was driving back to my place in Waynesboro early on a Sunday morning. I chose to take the Blue Ridge Parkway because the regular highway was under construction and I had time. The parkway is beautiful that time of year, early November, the last of the fall colors still clinging to the trees, the morning air crisp and clear. Or it should have been clear. Instead, I drove straight into the thickest fog I'd ever encountered. It came on suddenly, maybe 10 miles into the parkway. One moment I had clear visibility. The next I was surrounded by dense white fog that reduced my vision to maybe 20 feet. I slowed down, turned on my headlights and hazards, and kept driving carefully. Fog in the mountains isn't unusual. It burns off as the sun rises. I'd just drive slow and careful until I got through it. Except after 15 minutes, I started noticing something strange about this fog. It had an edge, a distinct boundary line where the dense white fog ended sharply and clearer air began. I could see it ahead of me, a wall of fog with a perfectly straight vertical edge, like someone had drawn a line in the air and filled one side with white. Fog doesn't do that. Fog is diffuse, gradual. It fades in and out. It doesn't have sharp boundaries. I slowed down even more, watching this impossible edge approaching. As I reached it, I crossed from fog into clearer air, and something felt wrong immediately. The road surface looked different. The pavement was older, more weathered, with a pattern of cracks I hadn't noticed before. The guardrails were a different style, lower and more rusted, and the trees seemed closer to the road, not trimmed back the way the Park Service keeps them. I looked in my rearview mirror and saw the fog wall behind me, that same sharp edge, but from this side I could see through the fog slightly. And what I saw on the other side looked different, more modern, better maintained, like I was looking at two versions of the same road separated by that wall of fog. My GPS, which had been working fine, suddenly glitched. The display flickered, and when it stabilized, it showed my location but with a date of October 18th, 1963. I stared at it, assumed it was a malfunction, and tried rebooting it. When it came back up, it still showed 1963. The current date field was showing November 8th, 2020, but the location data timestamp was from 57 years ago. I kept driving, and after maybe 2 miles, I saw a gas station ahead. One of the old overlook areas, with a small station and gift shop, but it looked wrong. The building was in better condition than it should have been, painted a color I'd never seen on Park Service buildings. The gas pumps were old-fashioned, the kind with actual numbers on rolling dials. And there was a car parked there, a 1960s model sedan, perfectly maintained, looking brand new. I pulled in, thinking maybe it was a historical reenactment or some kind of vintage car show, but there was no one around. The gas station looked open, lights on inside, but when I approached the door, I could see through the window that the interior was furnished like something from the 60s. Magazine rack with magazines I could see the dates on, all from 1963. A wall clock showing the correct time of day, but with a date wheel reading October 1963. I backed away from the building, thoroughly freaked out now, and that's when I saw the fog line again. It had moved. It was now between me and the road, a wall of dense white fog cutting across the parking lot. On the other side of it, I could see the same gas station, but it looked abandoned. Boarded up, the paint peeling, the gas pumps gone, the modern, deteriorated version I remembered driving past on previous trips. I ran back to my car and drove forward, back through the fog wall. As I crossed it, the GPS glitched again, and when it stabilized, the timestamp showed 2020. I looked in my rear-view mirror at the gas station, and it was abandoned again. Derelict. The car that had been parked there was gone, like crossing that line of fog had transported me back to my own time. I should have turned around. Should have gone back the way I came and gotten off the parkway immediately. Instead, driven by a need to understand what was happening, I kept driving forward. And I kept crossing that fog line, over and over, as it moved across the road in front of me, behind me, sometimes parallel to the road, creating a shifting boundary between time periods. Each time I crossed it, things changed. On one side, the parkway looked modern, well-maintained, with contemporary cars occasionally passing. On the other side, it looked older, from different eras. Sometimes the 1960s, sometimes earlier, sometimes what looked like the 1980s. The fog line wasn't consistent in what time period it led to. It was like the mountains themselves were holding multiple eras simultaneously, and the fog was somehow making the boundaries visible and crossable. I started paying attention to the other vehicles. When I was on the modern side, I saw current model cars and SUVs. When I crossed to the other side, I saw vintage vehicles, and some of the drivers looked as confused as I felt. I passed a woman in a 1970s station wagon who was driving incredibly slowly, her face pale with confusion, looking around like she couldn't understand what she was seeing. When I crossed back to modern time and looked in my rearview mirror, her car was gone, trapped on the other side of the fog line, or maybe never there at all. The GPS became my way of tracking which era I was in. Each time I crossed the fog, it would glitch and update with a new timestamp. 1963, 1970, 1989, 2003, 2020, 1971. The dates seemed random, no pattern I could identify. Sometimes I'd cross back into 2020, drive for a mile in my own time, then hit another fog wall and end up in 1985. At one point, I pulled over at an overlook, needing to process what was happening. I could see the valley below, and it was shifting. Through the fog, I could see multiple versions of it simultaneously. Modern development in some areas, farmland in others. In one section, I could see what looked like virgin forest, never logged, no roads or buildings at all. The fog wasn't just moving through space, it was moving through time, and wherever it touched, it brought different eras into brief alignment with each other. I saw another driver who'd pulled over, a man in a suit standing next to a 1960s Cadillac, staring at his hands like he couldn't believe they were real. I approached him carefully. "Are you seeing this?" I asked. "The fog? The time shifts?" He looked at me with wild eyes. "I'm driving to a job interview in Charlottesville. It's October 15th, 1963. That's today's date. But you're not from 1963. Your clothes, your car, you're from somewhere else." He looked around frantically. "What's happening? Is this death? Did I die in an accident and not realize it?" Before I could answer, the fog line moved between us, and he vanished, simply ceased to exist from my perspective. His car was gone. When the fog shifted again minutes later, the space where he'd been standing showed nothing. No car, no man, just empty overlook. Whatever force was operating here, it wasn't keeping people from different eras visible to each other for long. I got back in my car and kept driving, because what else was I going to do? The fog followed me, or I was following it, shifting and moving, creating that impossible boundary that separated then from now. My radio picked up stations that shouldn't exist, playing music from decades past. At one point, it caught a news broadcast clearly from the 1970s, talking about events I recognized from history books. The experience went on for hours. I'd see landmarks I recognized, but they'd be in different states of construction or decay depending on which side of the fog I was on. I saw the same overlook 5 different times across different eras, watching it transition from newly constructed to weathered to abandoned to renovated. I saw a forest grow and be cleared and grow back in the span of minutes as I moved through the fog. Eventually, around 1 in the afternoon, I crossed through a particularly thick section of fog and came out the other side to find myself near Waynesboro, near my exit. The GPS showed 2020, current date, correct time. I looked behind me and the fog was gone. Just normal mountain air, clear visibility, everything exactly as it should be in November 2020. I pulled off at my exit and drove home in a state of shock. The entire trip, which should have taken maybe 2 hours, had taken over 6. I checked my phone, which I'd forgotten about during the experience. No service for most of the parkway, which was normal. But when I reviewed my Photos app, I found pictures I didn't remember taking. Images from inside my car showing the view through my windshield. And in each one, the scenery was different, from different eras. I had accidentally documented my journey through time without consciously doing so. I spent the next week researching everything I could about the Blue Ridge Mountains, the parkway, temporal anomalies, anything that might explain what I'd experienced. I found references to fog phenomena, to reports of people getting lost for hours in areas that should take minutes to traverse. I found old stories about the mountains holding time differently, about certain hollows where the seasons didn't change normally, about drivers who claimed to have seen the parkway under construction, even though it had been completed decades earlier. I talked to a physicist friend, tried to describe what happened in scientific terms. He mentioned theories about time being less linear than we perceive, about the possibility of different timelines existing in parallel, separated by boundaries that are normally imperceptible. He said mountains, with their mass and age, might create gravitational effects that could, theoretically, warp space-time in ways we don't understand. But he also said there was no evidence for any of this, that it was all theoretical speculation. I've driven the Blue Ridge Parkway 3 times since then, always in different weather conditions, different times of day. I've never encountered that fog again, never crossed that boundary line. Everything has been perfectly normal, perfectly explainable, but I keep the photos on my phone, the ones I don't remember taking, showing views of the parkway from different decades. They're proof, though proof of what I'm not entirely sure. I'm still a rational person. I still trust data and evidence. But now I understand that reality might be more complicated than our usual frameworks can accommodate. That there might be places, particularly old places, deep places, where the normal rules don't quite apply, where the past and present, and maybe even the future, exist simultaneously, separated by boundaries as thin and permeable as fog. And sometimes, under the right conditions, those boundaries become visible, become crossable, and you find yourself driving through decades like they're just different lanes on the same road. The mountains are old, older than human civilization, older than our calendars and our ways of measuring time. Maybe they remember all their ages at once, hold them all in simultaneity, and sometimes that reality bleeds through in ways we can perceive. Maybe that fog was always there, and I just happened to see it. Or maybe it manifested specifically on that morning, for reasons I'll never understand. I don't have answers. I just have the experience, and the memory of driving through walls of fog that divided then from now, and the knowledge that somewhere in Virginia's Blue Ridge Mountains, time isn't as fixed as we pretend it is. The fog might come back tomorrow, or never again. But it's there, somewhere holding boundaries between eras that are thinner than we want to believe. And if you drive the parkway early on a foggy November morning, you might see it too. You might cross that line and find yourself somewhere when you thought you were only going somewhere else. My name is Bodie, and I spent August of 2018 helping my uncle with tobacco harvest on his farm in rural Appalachia, North Carolina. I needed the work, he needed the help, and I figured a month of manual labor in the mountains would be good for me after losing my desk job in Charlotte. What I didn't expect was to spend that month watching the neighboring farm's workers harvest the same field every single day, dawn to dusk, in perfect silence, wearing clothes from 70 years ago. What I didn't expect was to learn that those workers died of heat stroke in August of 1951, but nobody told them they could stop working. My uncle's farm was small by commercial standards, maybe 40 acres of tobacco and some corn, worked by him and whatever family or hired help he could get during harvest season. The property had been in our family since the 1930s, passed down through generations who'd made their living from the land. Uncle Luciano was the last of his generation still farming, everyone else having moved to cities or sold out to developers. He was 68, stubborn as hell, and insisted he'd die before he'd stop growing tobacco, even though the market had collapsed and he barely broke even most years. I arrived on a Sunday in early August, and Uncle Luciano put me to work immediately. Tobacco harvest is brutal, physical labor that hasn't changed much in 100 years, despite mechanization elsewhere. You're in the fields at dawn, cropping leaves, hauling them to the barn, hanging them to cure in 100-degree heat. By the end of the first day, every muscle in my body was screaming, and I understood why Uncle Luciano needed help. On my second morning, I noticed the neighboring farm. It ran alongside my uncle's property, separated by a tree line and an old barbed wire fence. I could see workers in the tobacco field, maybe a dozen of them, moving methodically through the rows. They were dressed oddly, I thought, wearing what looked like old-fashioned work clothes, but I figured maybe they were part of some traditional farming operation or religious community that preferred older styles. What struck me was their coordination. They moved in perfect synchronization, bending to crop leaves at exactly the same moment, standing, moving forward, bending again, like a choreographed dance, except there was no music, no communication I could hear, just silent, mechanical efficiency. "Who owns the farm next door?" I asked Uncle Luciano over lunch that first week. He was quiet for a long moment, chewing his sandwich, looking anywhere but at me. "Nobody you need to worry about," he finally said. "Just focus on our work." But I couldn't stop watching them. Every morning when we went out to the fields, they were already there. Every evening when we quit, they were still working. They never seemed to take breaks, never stopped for water, never paused to wipe sweat or adjust their clothes. Just constant rhythmic movement through the same field, day after day. "Do they harvest every day?" I asked Uncle Luciano after about a week. "Don't they need to let the plants rest between croppings?" "Tobacco doesn't work that way. You crop the lower leaves first, then come back for higher leaves as they mature over several weeks. You don't harvest the same section daily." Uncle Luciano's jaw tightened. "Bodie, I'm going to say this once. Don't ask about that farm. Don't look at it more than you have to. And for God's sake, don't go over there. Some things in these mountains don't need examining. They just need to be left alone." That, of course, made me more curious. I started paying closer attention when I could do so without Uncle Luciano noticing. The workers never varied their routine. Same field, same rows, same movements every single day. They wore overalls and work shirts that looked like they were from the 1950s, faded blue denim and cotton that was stained dark with sweat. Their faces, when I could see them from a distance, were blank. No expression, no emotion, just empty faces performing empty labor. One afternoon, when Uncle Luciano went into town for supplies, I decided to investigate. I walked along the fence line to where I could get a better view of the neighboring farm. Up close, the wrongness became more apparent. The workers moved with inhuman precision, their actions too synchronized to be natural. And they didn't cast shadows properly. The afternoon sun was angled from the west, but their shadows seemed to fall in slightly wrong directions, as if they existed in a different relationship to light than the rest of the world. I stood there watching for maybe 20 minutes, and in that time, I saw them complete a full circuit of the field, harvesting leaves, carrying them to a wagon, returning to start again. The same field they'd been working all week. The same field that somehow never ran out of tobacco to harvest, never showed any sign of being depleted by constant cropping. That evening, I drove to the county clerk's office before it closed and looked up the property records. The neighboring farm was listed as owned by someone named Caden, property gone to seed in 1952. There were notes in the file about failed tax sales, about the land being considered worthless, about attempts to contact heirs that went nowhere, and there was a newspaper clipping from August of 1951, yellowed and fragile. Tragedy at Caden Farm. 13 workers dead from heat stroke during tobacco harvest. Temperatures reached 105 degrees. Workers collapsed in field, unable to reach shade or water. Owner Caden found unconscious but alive. Workers all deceased. Farm to be liquidated. 13 workers. I counted the figures in the field the next morning. 13 people, moving in synchronized silence, harvesting tobacco that had been dead for nearly 70 years. I confronted Uncle Luciano that night, showed him the newspaper clipping I'd photocopied. He looked at it for a long time, then sighed, deeply. "You couldn't leave it alone, could you?" He poured himself a glass of whiskey, drank half of it, then started talking. That was the worst day these mountains had seen in generations. August 18th, 1951. Temperature hit 106 degrees, no breeze, humidity like you were breathing water. Caden's crew was trying to get the harvest in before foreclosure hit the farm. They'd been working since before dawn, no real breaks, just pushing to get it done. By mid-afternoon, they started dropping. One, then another, then half the crew. Caden tried to get them to the house, but he collapsed too. They found them the next evening. Caden survived. His workers didn't. He finished his whiskey. Caden never recovered mentally. Died in a state hospital 5 years later, kept saying he could hear them working, that they wouldn't stop, that he couldn't make them stop. People thought it was guilt and grief. Some of us knew better. "They're still there," I said. "Still working. Why?" "Because they died working," Uncle Luciano said simply. Died with the work unfinished, died believing they had to keep going, or they'd lose their jobs, their homes, their lives. And somehow, some way, that desperation and exhaustion and fear got burned into the land itself. They've been harvesting that same field every day since 1951, trying to finish work that can never be finished, because they're harvesting ghosts of tobacco on a ghost of a farm. I spent the rest of my time there, trying not to watch them, but I couldn't help it. Once you knew what you were seeing, the horror of it became inescapable. Those weren't just ghosts going through motions. They were people, or had been people, trapped in the worst day of their lives, repeating it endlessly, working in impossible heat, bodies past the point of exhaustion, but unable to stop because stopping meant losing everything. I started noticing more details that made it worse. Their clothes never changed, but they showed progressive sweat stains as the day went on, as if each day repeated the physical progression of that fatal August day in 1951. By afternoon, the figures moved more slowly, more laboriously, bent with exhaustion. By evening, some would collapse in the field, lying motionless for a few minutes before standing and resuming work. They were reenacting their deaths every single day, and then getting up and doing it again. One morning, I got to the fence line just after dawn and watched them begin their work. They appeared gradually as the sun rose, fading into visibility like photographs developing. and in that moment of transition, I could see their faces clearly. They looked terrified. Absolutely terrified. Mouths open in silent screams, eyes wide with panic and pain. Then the full sun hit, and their expressions went blank again, and they began the day's mechanical labor. They knew. On some level, they knew they were dead, knew they were trapped, knew they were repeating their final day forever. But they couldn't stop, couldn't break the cycle, couldn't do anything but harvest tobacco that didn't exist on a farm that had died with them. I asked Uncle Luciano why no one did anything, why the land wasn't blessed or exorcised or whatever you do for haunted ground. He laughed bitterly. Who'd come out here to do that? And for what? They're not hurting anyone. They're just there, working, like they always did. And maybe that's their punishment, or maybe it's all they know how to do, but either way, it's not our place to interfere. On my last day, I stood at the fence line and watched them work. It was August 18th, 2018, exactly 67 years after they died. The temperature hit 103 degrees, and the figures in the field moved with visible exhaustion, collapsing more frequently, taking longer to rise. I wondered if August 18th was always harder for them, if the anniversary brought the memory closer, made the echo of that terrible day stronger. One of them, a young man who couldn't have been more than 20 when he died, collapsed near the fence line. He lay there in the dirt, his chest heaving with phantom breaths, his face turned toward me. And for just a moment, his blank expression broke, and I saw desperate pleading in his eyes. Help us. Please, let us stop. Let us rest. I wanted to. God, I wanted to. But I didn't know how. I didn't know if it was even possible to free them from whatever force bound them to that field, to that work, to that endless August day in 1951. I stood there uselessly, while he slowly, mechanically stood up and resumed harvesting tobacco that existed only in the echo of a tragedy 70 years old. I left the farm that afternoon, told Uncle Luciano I appreciated the work, but needed to get back to Charlotte. He knew why I was really leaving, and he didn't try to stop me. As I drove away, I looked in my rearview mirror and saw them still working in the fading light. Those 13 souls who died trying to finish a harvest, and were somehow still trying, would always be trying, until the land itself forgot what happened there. Uncle Luciano died in 2020. The farm was sold to developers, who'll probably turn it into a subdivision. I don't know what happened to the neighboring property, the farm where 13 people work forever in silent, synchronized desperation. Maybe the developers will buy it too, bulldoze it, build houses on top of that haunted ground. Maybe the new residents will see them on hot August mornings, those figures in the field wearing clothes from another era, harvesting nothing, accomplishing nothing, trapped in labor that has no purpose except that it's all they have left. Or maybe when the land is finally disturbed, when the last trace of that tobacco farm is erased, maybe then they'll finally be allowed to stop. Maybe the cycle will break, and 13 exhausted souls can finally rest after 70 years of work that should never have killed them, that shouldn't still be killing them day after day after day. But I doubt it. Some echoes are too strong to erase. Some tragedies burn too deep. And some people die with work so far unfinished that not even death itself can convince them to stop trying. Thanks for joining me in the shadows. If this story unsettled you, hit that like button and subscribe to Bleak Fears for more sinister tales from the Pacific Northwest. Share your own encounters in the comments below. I read every one. Remember, the darkest horrors hide in familiar places. Until next time, stay vigilant and keep your fears close.